They called him the Iron Alpha, conqueror of 7 kingdoms, undefeated in 43 battles, the kind of man history carves into stone while he's still breathing. And they left him at the altar of his own court, stripped of dignity by the one thing no blade ever managed to reach, his own people. This is the story of a king who forgot that crowns don't protect you from the one standing closest, and the woman who arrived as tribute and stayed as the only truth he'd ever trusted. Stay till the end. Hit like. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. The morning they brought Lady Seris Vale to Blackspire Citadel, the mountains were the color of old iron, and the sky sat low and bruised above the northern passes like a wound that had never properly closed. She arrived in a convoy of 6 wagons. No military escort, no ceremonial banners. The horses were thin-ribbed from the journey, and their breath came out in clouds that dissolved before they reached the height of a man's chest. The roads into Blackspire were carved from the bones of a mountain range that had been killing travelers for 300 years, and the convoy bore the evidence of that relationship across every wheel and axle, cracked wood, mud-caked iron, the particular exhaustion that settles into animals and people alike when the cold has had them long enough. Ceres sat in the second wagon with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, because her mother had told her once, when she was 7 years old and crying over a dead cat, that grief was private and the world had no right to watch you perform it. That lesson had been forged deeper by the years since, by the famine, by the political collapse of Silvermere that had hollowed the province out like a winter-killed tree, standing upright but empty inside, by the negotiations she had not been invited to, but whose outcome had been delivered to her in a single sentence by Lord Aldrich, the senior minister of a court that no longer had a functioning king. You are the price of grain. She had not wept then. She did not weep now. She watched the citadel grow larger through the wagon's narrow window and catalogued its details the way her healer's training had taught her to catalog symptoms, dispassionately, completely, without flinching from what she saw. Blackspire Citadel was not beautiful. It had never been intended to be. It rose from volcanic stone that had been here long before any king thought to build on it, black and irregular and brutally functional, its towers thick-walled and arrow-slit narrow, designed by men who believed the purpose of architecture was to survive siege rather than inspire poetry. The main gate was 3 inches of iron-banded oak studded with bolts the size of a man's fist. The walls were 40 feet high. The battlements were manned even now, in peacetime, by soldiers in gray wool who stood their posts with the particular stillness of men who understood that their king did not regard vigilance as optional. She understood, looking at it, that she was not entering a palace. She was entering a statement. The wagon stopped in the outer courtyard, and a steward whose face bore the careful blankness of a man who had learned to express nothing within these walls descended to open the door. He did not offer his hand. She did not require it. She stepped down onto the cobblestones, and the cold hit her immediately. The specific cold of the north, not merely low temperature but something with weight and intention to it, the kind of cold that found the gap between your collar and your jaw and pushed through. She wore the silver morning silk because Lord Aldrich had sent it with a note explaining that it was traditional in Frost Hollow for tribute brides to wear pale colors at the ceremonial binding. She had read the note twice, folded it carefully, and then burned it in her small fire because there were some insults that deserved that particular response. The inner courtyard was already assembled. She saw them as she was led through the second gate. The court of Blackspire arranged in the cold morning air with a precision that suggested the arrangement had been rehearsed, which it probably had. Nobles in dark wool and fox fur, military commanders with their insignia bright against heavy cloaks, advisors and ministers, and the particular species of courtier who exists in every empire, those hollow-eyed observers who have survived by becoming perfect mirrors of whoever holds power, reflecting back what is desired and revealing nothing of themselves. They watched her cross the courtyard, and she felt their assessment like a physical thing. The famine bride. That was what the rumors had called her, reaching Silvermere weeks before the convoy departed. She had heard the phrase from a traveling merchant who had not known who she was, and had repeated it with the casual cruelty of a man sharing interesting gossip. The Iron Alpha takes a famine bride, pays in grain for a lord's daughter. What does that say about Silvermere? She knew what it said. She had known for months. It said exactly what was true. that Silvermere had broken and its people were hungry and survival required a currency that she happened to possess in the form of her own body and her own future. She had made her peace with that. Or she had built a wall around the part of herself that had not made peace with it, which was close enough to the same thing for functional purposes. King Draven Thorne was waiting at the obsidian altar. She had heard descriptions of him, assembled from travelers' accounts and diplomatic dispatches, and the kind of battlefield mythology that gathers around men who win consistently enough that other men start inventing reasons for it. The Iron Alpha, undefeated, cold-blooded, a king whose judgment carried the weight of execution because it frequently did. The descriptions had not been wrong exactly, but they had described the surface of a thing and missed the quality underneath it. He was large, genuinely large. Not the performed largeness of a man who stands at the front of parades, but the settled, practical size of someone whose body had been built by decades of real use. His shoulders were broad in the way that functional shoulders are broad, not decorative. His dark armor was scarred in the particular patterns left by blades that had come close enough to mark the metal without killing the man inside it, which told her something about the quality of the enemies he had faced. His face was hard-planed and weathered, and the scar that ran from his left cheekbone toward his jaw was old enough to have faded from red to silver, a scar that had been there long enough that his face had incorporated it into its geography rather than fighting the interruption. His eyes were dark. They were also, she noticed, with the part of her mind that catalogued things precisely and against her will, looking at her with an intensity that was not the evaluating look of a man assessing a political acquisition. She filed that observation away and kept her expression still and walked the last 20 feet to the altar with her back as straight as her mother had taught her. The ceremony was brief. Draven's voice was low and flat and carried the particular quality of a voice that was accustomed to being obeyed rather than persuasive, not commanding in a theatrical way, but commanding in the way of a gravitational field, simply present and therefore organizing everything around it. He placed the ring on her finger. Black iron, cold even through the ceremony gloves she wore. You belong to my empire now. No softening of tone, no performance of warmth. The words fell into the ceremonial silence of the courtyard like stones dropped into still water, clean and without decoration. She met his eyes. I understand, she said. His expression shifted. Not much, a fraction of something that might have been surprise or might have been recalibration. The look of a man who had expected a different response and was filing the actual one away for later consideration. The assembled court exhaled collectively. The ceremony was complete. The transaction was recorded. The feast that followed was Seris's first education in the social architecture of Blackspire. She was seated at the high table to Draven's right, which meant she was visible to the entire hall, which meant every interaction she had for the next 3 hours was observed, analyzed, and assigned meaning by people who had made careers out of that particular skill. She ate carefully and drank sparingly and answered questions when they were directed at her with the precise minimum of information required, which was a skill she had developed across years of being underestimated in Silvermere's own court and had refined further in the months since Lord Aldrich's announcement. She watched the room. She noted who spoke to whom. She observed the particular way that lower-ranked nobles positioned their bodies slightly toward Draven, even when in conversation with someone else. The constant gravitational orientation of people in the presence of a power they could not afford to ignore. She also noticed how they spoke about her when they thought she could not hear. Brought nothing but a pretty face and prophecies the king doesn't believe in. Silvermere's shame gift-wrapped in silk. How long before he tires of her? A season? 2? She continued eating. The particular quality of court cruelty was that it expected a reaction, either wounded retreat or defensive performance, both of which confirmed the cruelty's accuracy. The only response that cost them anything was none at all. It was Lord Varric who crossed the line. He was a war commander of the northern campaigns, wide through the chest and red-faced from wine, and from the particular confidence of a man who had spent decades in rooms where his size and his rank meant no one challenged him directly. He had been watching her since the feast began with the kind of attention that was less appreciation than assessment, the calculating look of a man determining not whether something was valuable, but whether it was accessible. He approached during a lull in the formal proceedings. When the high table had dispersed somewhat and Seris had moved slightly from her seat to speak with a minister's wife who had asked about the medicinal traditions of Silvermere, one of the few genuine questions she had received all evening. Varric came up beside her and put his hand on her arm. Not aggressive, technically, not obviously threatening, but firm. The grip of a man reminding a woman of the architecture of power in this room. "The bride of Blackspire," he said. "They said Silvermere had nothing worth trading." His eyes moved over her in the slow, deliberate way that was meant to be felt as much as seen. "I see the exaggeration was mutual." Seris looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at it the way she might look at a symptom she was diagnosing, calmly, completely, categorizing the information it provided. Then she looked up at him. "You should remove your hand," she said. Her voice was quiet, not frightened, not performatively bold either, just flat and certain, the voice of a woman who had made an accurate assessment and was sharing the result. Varric smiled. Around them she was aware of the shift in attention, the subtle turning of faces, the particular silence that spreads through a room when something worth watching is happening. "Bold words," Varric said, "for a famine bride." He had not removed his hand. She was about to speak again, and she had already decided what she was going to say, and had already accepted the consequences of saying it, when she became aware of a change in the room's acoustic quality. A particular silence fell. Not the silence of anticipation, but the silence that happens when something with real gravity enters a space and the air rearranges itself accordingly. She did not need to look to know who had crossed the room. She heard Draven before she saw him. Not his voice, he had not spoken yet, but the sound of the room responding to him, the way conversations died mid-sentence and feet shifted, and the ambient social noise of 100 people eating and drinking simply stopped, replaced by the specific held-breath quality of an audience that understood something was about to happen. He crossed the hall with terrifying silence. That was the only accurate description. He moved through the crowd without rushing, without theater, without the performed anger of a man who wants his fury witnessed. He simply moved, and people cleared his path with the instinctive urgency of creatures who understand structural force when it approaches. Varric had 2 seconds of awareness before the king reached him. What Draven did was not complicated. He took Varric's wrist, the wrist attached to the hand that remained on Seris's arm, and he applied pressure with the particular precision of a man who understood anatomy well enough to know exactly where to place force to achieve a specific result. There was a sound, not loud, the kind of sound that carried because the room had gone completely silent in the preceding moment. Varric went white. His hand released her arm. His body dropped involuntarily toward the angle that reduced the leverage Draven was applying to his wrist. Draven held him there for a moment. 1 moment exactly, calibrated. Then he released him. "Touch her again," Draven said, "and lose the hand that offended me." He said it quietly. That was the detail Seris would remember later. Not the violence, which she had seen in cruder forms, but the quietness. The absolute absence of performance. He said it the way a man states a physical law of the universe. Not as a threat, but as information. As accurate description of future consequence. Varric straightened. His face had gone through several colors during the preceding seconds. He said nothing. The calculation in his eyes was visible even from where Seris stood, the calculation of a man determining whether his pride was worth what acting on it would cost, and arriving at the correct answer. He retreated. The hall returned to its dinner noise in the careful, gradual way of a group of people pretending they had not collectively witnessed what they had just witnessed. Draven did not look at Seris. He turned and walked back toward the high table. The room exhaled behind him. But in the moment before he turned, she had seen his face in profile, and she had seen the muscle along his jaw set hard against something that was not anger. Anger, she recognized. This was something colder and more complicated, the expression of a man managing an internal response that his public posture did not permit him to display. She understood, standing there with the ghost of Varric's grip fading from her arm, that she had misread the architecture of this situation. She had arrived expecting possession. She had expected the transaction to be straightforward. Her freedom in exchange for Silvermere's survival, ownership confirmed and demonstrated and then managed at arm's length in whatever arrangement suited a king who had acquired her as policy rather than preference. Instead, she was standing in the wreckage of a war commander's wrist and reassessing every assumption she had made on the journey north. A king who claimed ownership also enforced protection with savage certainty. That frightened her more than hatred ever could. Hatred was predictable. Hatred had a shape she understood: cold indifference shading toward cruelty, the casual contempt of power for utility. She knew how to navigate that. She had been navigating it for years. But this was something else. This was a contradiction at the center of a man who had built himself entirely around the concept of internal consistency. And contradictions in powerful people were not comforting. Contradictions meant unpredictability. Contradictions meant there were depths you hadn't mapped and edges you hadn't found yet. She picked up her wine. She drank it carefully. She did not look at the high table. She thought about the ring on her finger, still cold, and about what it meant that the man who had placed it there had not used the word devotion or duty or alliance or any of the formal vocabulary of political marriage. He had said, belong. And then he had proven, with Varric's shattered wrist, that belonging to his empire meant something specific and apparently non-negotiable. She would need to understand exactly what that meant. She would need to understand it carefully, because she had the strong and unsettling sense that getting it wrong would cost her more than she could calculate tonight. 3 weeks into Blackspire, Seris had mapped the Citadel's social geography with the same methodical attention she applied to everything. She knew which corridors the servants used. She knew the names of the 12 soldiers who rotated through the guard posts nearest her chambers, and she knew which of them had families in the lower city and which had come up through the military ranks without connections, and which one, a young soldier named Fen, read medical texts in his off hours because his younger sister had a coughing illness the physicians hadn't been able to explain. She had given Fen the name of an herb that grew in the lower valleys and would open the airways during a winter cough, and she had watched his expression shift from the careful blankness of professional neutrality to something genuine and startled, the look of a person who has been unexpectedly seen. She cultivated healers and archivists with the same deliberateness. Not manipulation exactly. She had no agenda beyond the one she had always carried, which was that knowledge was the only form of power that couldn't be confiscated at a gate. The archivists had records going back 2 centuries. The healers had relationships with every family in Blackspire, high and low. Both were invisible to the court's formal power structure in the way that useful people often are. Both talked. What they told her assembled itself into a portrait of Blackspire that was considerably more complicated than the one she had arrived with. Draven Thorne had inherited the empire at 19 after his father died of a lung sickness that the court physicians had been unable to arrest, and that Seris, reading the symptoms through the archivist's records, thought might have been manageable with different treatment. He had been ruling for 11 years. In that time, he had fought 7 campaigns, none of which he had lost, and had expanded the empire's eastern borders by approximately 1/3. He had also, less celebrated in the formal histories, implemented a grain distribution system that had significantly reduced mortality in the empire's northern provinces during the last 3 hard winters. That last detail was not in the official records. An archivist named Marin, who had been at Blackspire for 30 years and had therefore outlasted enough political fashions to have stopped caring what was safe to say, mentioned it while showing Seris the medical histories. "He doesn't publicize it," Marin said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone reporting a fact. "The distribution system. Some of the commanders think it's soft policy. He doesn't argue with them about it." Seris had absorbed that in silence and filed it beside everything else she was filing. The cloak she had found draped over her when she woke from sleep beside the dying hearth, placed with precision over her shoulders without waking her, which could only have been placed there by someone who had entered her chambers while she slept, and had done so with enough silence and care to accomplish the task without her knowledge. The rare southern fruit that had begun appearing with her evening meals, fruit that she recognized from the nobility's table because she had seen it precisely twice since arriving at Blackspire. The silent guards who appeared in her peripheral vision whenever she moved through the less trafficked parts of the Citadel, maintaining distance with the professional discretion of men who had been told to protect someone without making that protection visible. The king who dismissed her publicly protected her in the dark. She sat with that knowledge for several days before she could look at it directly, because there was a version of this that was simply calculated politics. A king maintaining the value of his political acquisition by ensuring it survived long enough to be useful. And there was another version that was something Seris did not want to name yet, because naming it would require her to renegotiate a significant amount of what she had decided about her situation, and she had built her equilibrium on those decisions, and equilibrium was a resource she could not afford to waste. She chose for the time being to observe without concluding. It was the only intellectually honest option available. She was in the lower library 3 weeks after arriving when the first vision struck. She had been reading a text on the medicinal properties of northern plants, cross-referencing what she knew from Silvermere's traditions with what Blackspire's healers used when it happened. No warning, no gradual onset of the kind she might have defended against. One moment she was reading, the next she was somewhere else. Blood across snow. Black towers burning from the inside, not the outside. Fire running up stone as though the stone itself was fuel. A banner, silver stag on gray field, Blackspire's standard. Consumed by flame from the corner inward, the stag's silver outline holding for a moment against the fire before surrendering. A face. She knew the face. She had seen it at the feast, at the council sessions she had been permitted to observe, in the corridors where the court assembled itself for daily political performance. Young, angular, charismatic in the way of people who have decided that charisma is a weapon. Dark-eyed, like Draven, but without the weight behind the darkness. Something hungrier in those eyes, something that looked at every room it entered and calculated what it could take from it. Prince Draven Thorne, Draven's cousin, next in the line of succession. Then she was back in the library with her hand pressed flat against the reading table and her breath coming in short pulls, and Marin watching her from across the room with the expression of a woman who had been at Blackspire long enough to have seen most things, but was seeing something new. "Are you ill?" Marin asked. "No," Seris said. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table until they stopped. She had been having visions since she was 12 years old. She had spent the years since developing a precise vocabulary for what they were and were not, because precision was the only defense against the interpretations other people wanted to impose on them. They were not prophecy in the absolute sense. They were not madness. They were not, as her father's court physician had suggested when she was 14, a symptom of hysteria that could be managed with bloodletting and reduced food intake. They were information. Specific, accurate information about events that had not yet happened, delivered in fragments that required interpretation, presented in a form that made witnesses to them deeply uncomfortable, because the witnesses generally preferred their information to arrive through established channels that they controlled. She had learned to keep them private. She had learned this the hard way across years of watching people's responses to demonstrated knowledge that exceeded the explainable, the fear that expressed itself as contempt, the contempt that expressed itself as cruelty, the particular isolation of being accurate in front of people who needed you to be wrong. She was cataloging this latest one, committing the details to the organized memory she had developed for this purpose, when the library doors opened and she looked up. Draven stood in the doorway. She had not heard him approach, which she had begun to accept as simply a feature of his movement through the world. He carried his size with the particular contained quality of something that has been very dangerous for a long time and has learned that the announcement of danger is tactical weakness. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He said, "You were not at the morning council session." "I was not invited to the morning council session," she said. A pause. He stepped into the library. The space rearranged itself around his presence the way all spaces rearranged themselves around him. Not because he demanded it, but because the geometry of rooms changes when you add a sufficient mass to them. "You were present at the last 3, he said. "You permitted me to observe them," she said. "I interpreted that permission as contingent on its continuation rather than its permanence. Was I incorrect?" He looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes looked at things, with the specific focused attention of a man who is genuinely processing something rather than performing the appearance of thought. "No," he said. "You were not incorrect." He moved to the far shelf. He was not here for her, or not primarily. He occasionally came to this library himself, she had learned, the kind of ruler who regarded information as personal infrastructure rather than delegated responsibility. He selected a map case from the upper shelf and set it on the reading table 2 spaces down from where she sat. "You collapsed at the winter gathering yesterday," he said. His back was to her. He was unrolling the map. "I did not collapse," she said. "I lost my balance for approximately 4 seconds and corrected it." You collapsed, he said. I have eyes in that room. She considered several responses and selected the one that was most accurate. A vision, she said. He turned. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man revising a calculation. Tell me what you saw, he said. She had expected skepticism. She had prepared for it, had assembled the language she would use to frame the information in terms that a military mind accustomed to operational intelligence might accept. The careful translation of something experiential into something evidential. She had not prepared for immediate and direct solicitation. Blood on snow, she said. Blackspire burning from within. Your banner destroyed. And Kalor's face present in the image in a way that was not incidental. She paused. I am not interpreting. I am reporting the content. Draven held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, My father had the same gift. She had not expected that either. Sit down, he said. He pulled the chair from the adjacent table and sat across from her, the map forgotten, his elbows on the table, his scarred hands clasped in front of him. Up close like this, in the library's winter light rather than the formal lighting of the court or the fire-lit hall, she could see things the public settings obscured. The fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the particular set of his jaw that was not hardness for its own sake, but hardness built over something older. The way he looked at her with an attention that was entirely without the political performance that characterized every other interaction she had witnessed from him. He saw them as a young man, Draven said. Before they faded, he kept records. He believed they were accurate and acted on them twice, successfully. A pause. The court called it instinct. Because instinct is acceptable, Seris said. Visions imply something outside the chain of command. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of recognition. A ruler does not fear knowledge, he said. He fears blindness. She absorbed that. What did you do with the information, he said. It was not a question. I filed it, she said. I am still interpreting. Context determines significance. What context would you need? Kalor's recent activities, his alliances, the pattern of his movements over the past 6 months, whether his ambitions have moved from theoretical to operational. Draven was quiet for a moment. That is a sophisticated question, he said. I had a good library in Silvermere before the famine emptied it, she said, and a physician father who believed that diagnosis required evidence rather than assumption. Another pause. Longer this time. The eastern trade routes have been irregularly patrolled for 8 weeks, Draven said, and his voice had shifted into the flat operational register she recognized from the council sessions. I attributed it to winter conditions affecting the rotation schedules. I am no longer certain that attribution was complete. She sat with that. Kalor oversees the Eastern Patrol assignments, she said. He does. The weight of what was not being said settled between them like weather. I will watch for additional information, she said. He nodded. He stood. He picked up the map case. Then he stopped. He stood at the table with his back to her for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something. My father's records, he said. Marin knows where they are stored. If your method of working requires precedent, it may be useful. He left the library without looking back. She sat alone in the winter light for a long time after, her hand still on the reading table, the ghost of what had just happened settling into her understanding of her situation with the weight of a significant recalculation. The weeks that followed built their complexity in layers. Draven began the sword instruction without ceremony or announcement. He arrived at the Eastern Training Ground one morning where Seris had come to observe the military exercises. She had developed the habit of watching the training rotations, cataloging the physical conditions and skill levels of the garrison with the same methodical attention she applied to everything. Because fortifications required defenders, and defenders required maintenance, and the gap between Blackspire's official garrison strength and what she could observe in practice had been nagging at her, and he stood beside her for a moment watching the drill. Then he said, Your stance is wrong. She said, I am not currently holding a weapon. Your passive stance, he said. Your balance. If someone rushed you from the right, you would fall before you could correct. She looked at him. He walked to the weapons rack at the edge of the training ground and selected 2 practice blades. Not functional weapons, but solid wood, weighted to simulate steel. He held one out to her. Left hand, he said. Your dominant hand protects, while your non-dominant adapts. She took the practice blade. What followed was not elegant. She had no training with weapons. Her father had regarded weapons education for women as outside the scope of useful investment, an opinion she had found frustrating at the time and infuriating in retrospect given the various situations her life had subsequently placed her in. Draven corrected her grip. He corrected her footwork. He placed his hands on her shoulders to adjust her posture, and his hands were massive and scarred and careful, with the specific calibrated gentleness of a person who is very strong and has spent considerable time learning to moderate that strength in contexts where it is not an asset. Again, he said. I moved my foot, she said. You moved it after you should have moved it, he said. Survival is not about strength. Strength is irrelevant if the timing is wrong. Do it again. They worked for an hour. She was sweating despite the cold by the end of it, and her shoulder ached from an adjustment he had made to her blade position, and she had learned 3 things about her own physical habits that were not complementary. She had also learned something about him. He taught the way he commanded, directly, without cruelty, without performance, with the complete assumption that the person in front of him was capable of learning what was being taught. There was no condescension in his instruction. There was no implication that her ignorance was inherent rather than circumstantial. He treated her difficulty with the tasks the same way she imagined he treated a new recruit's difficulty, as a problem to be solved through repeated application of the correct technique, nothing more. You are not trying to win, he said at one point, while she was attempting a footwork pattern for the 4th time. I am trying to learn, she said. They are the same thing, he said. Winning requires learning to fail correctly. Every time you fall, you are teaching yourself where the edge is. The problem is, you are stopping before the edge because you are trying to avoid falling. She looked at him. My father said something similar about diagnosis, she said. You cannot understand what is wrong until you are willing to follow the symptom to its source, even when the source is unpleasant. He held her gaze for a moment. Yes, he said. They continued. Afterward, walking back through the citadel's interior corridors, while the cold settled hard around them and the torches in the brackets cast their irregular moving light, he said without preamble, My brother died during the plague of Eastmarch, 11 years ago. She did not respond immediately. She had learned that Draven's silences had architecture. They were not pauses waiting to be filled, but structures with specific shapes, and the appropriate response to a given silence depended on understanding its shape. This one had the shape of something being set down after being carried for a very long time. The rival houses delayed the aid vote for 3 weeks, he said, debating the cost, whether the province's strategic value justified the expenditure. A pause. By the time the aid reached Eastmarch, my brother had been dead for 12 days. The corridor, the torches, the cold. His name was Aldrich, Draven said. He was 16. He wanted to study architecture. He had drawings, hundreds of drawings. A pause. I burned the vote records when I took the throne. I wanted to know exactly who had voted to delay, and I wanted to know that they knew I knew. Did it help? She said. No, he said. Nothing helped. But it was honest. She thought about what she wanted to say and what she would not say and what the difference between them meant. I watched hunger take children in Silvermere for 3 years, she said. I had the knowledge to help and not enough resources to apply it. And the court would not reallocate the resources because reallocation required admitting the scale of the problem, and admitting the scale of the problem implied responsibility. And responsibility was the one thing the court unanimously refused. A pause. I understand the particular quality of helplessness that comes with watching something preventable proceed, because the people with the power to prevent it are more invested in protecting their position than protecting anyone else. He said nothing for several paces, then quietly, You were afraid when you arrived. I was not afraid, she said. I was accurate. Afraid, he said again, not unkindly. Your face when I placed the ring. You were calculating the cost of what you had agreed to. She considered denying it and decided against it. Yes, she said. The cost was real, he said. I am aware of it. I do not expect it to be forgotten because the strategic necessity was real. She stopped walking. He stopped a pace ahead and turned to look at her. What do you expect? She said. The question fell between them in the torch-lit corridor with all its weight intact. He held her gaze for a long time. I expect, he said, that people who have both lost things will understand that the management of loss is different from the absence of it. A pause. I am not a man who explains himself at length. I am telling you this once because I believe you are capable of understanding it correctly, and I believe you deserve accurate information. He turned and continued walking. She stood in the corridor for 3 seconds, processing. Then she followed him. Kaylor made his first move in public on a Tuesday, the kind of cold gray Tuesday that Blackspire produced in bulk during the deep winter, and he did it in the council chamber with perfect timing and a smile that had been calibrated to appear spontaneous. Seris was present. She had been attending council sessions regularly now, seated slightly behind Draven's position at the council table, visible to the room without being formally at the table itself, a position that Draven had established without explaining and that she had interpreted correctly as a deliberate ambiguity, neither full inclusion nor formal exclusion, the kind of positioning that invited people to underestimate its strategic content. The Eastern Garrison reports continue to show deterioration, Kaylor said. He was standing at the map table at the room's center, young and sharp-featured and dressed with the particular care of a man who understood that clothing in courts was a form of argument. Morale problems. Desertion rates up 14% from last quarter. The commanders are requesting reinforcements that we currently cannot spare from the central deployment. Draven said, "The Eastern Garrison is your oversight responsibility." "It is," Kaylor said. He said it pleasantly, as though the agreement were an opening rather than a concession. "And I've been examining the root causes. The commanders have raised concerns about focus at the command level." A pause, theatrical in its precision. Concerns about whether the strategic priorities of the Crown have remained consistent. The room's attention sharpened with the specific quality of a group of people who understood exactly what was being said and were watching to see how it would land. "Speak plainly," Draven said. "The Crown has devoted considerable attention to domestic arrangements in recent months," Kaylor said. His eyes moved briefly to Seris and back to Draven. "The garrison commanders are experienced men who fight better when they understand that strategic clarity is the leadership's primary concern." A pause. "Some of them have wondered whether, how to phrase this carefully, whether recent influences have altered the weight given to traditional military priorities." The council chamber was very quiet. Seris kept her expression still. She was watching Kaylor's hands, which were clasped behind his back, and she was watching the members of the council, who were watching Draven with the careful attention of people waiting to see whether prey had detected the trap. "You are suggesting," Draven said, "that my judgment has been compromised." "I am conveying concerns from the field," Kaylor said. "That is my function." "Name the commanders who raised these concerns," Draven said. A fractional pause, brief enough to be dismissible. "I received them informally, in the interest of—" "Name them," Draven said. The quality of Draven's voice in the council chamber was different from the quality of his voice in private conversation. In private, he was direct, occasionally almost gentle in his precision, the flatness of a man who did not waste words because he valued clarity too much for decoration. In the council chamber, the same flatness had a different quality entirely, the flatness of complete certainty, the particular tone of a man who has no doubt about the architecture of consequences. Kaylor's smile did not change, but something behind it recalibrated. "The names would require verification," he said. "I wouldn't want to create difficulties for men who spoke in confidence." "Then verify them," Draven said. "You will present their formal statements at the next session with their attestation." A pause. "If the garrison commanders have legitimate operational concerns, they will be addressed through established military channels. If they have political concerns, they should have delivered them directly, rather than through an intermediary." Another fractional pause from Kaylor. "Of course," he said. The session continued. Logistics, resource allocation, winter supply assessments. Seris observed the rest of it with the part of her attention that wasn't processing what had just happened. He would not provide the names. She was certain of it, because there were no names, or not names of garrison commanders, not names of men who had spoken in any informal channel. The complaint was invented, scaffolding for an accusation that was real. The accusation wrapped in false specificity to give it the texture of operational intelligence rather than political attack. Afterward, walking through the corridor outside the council chamber, Kaelor passed close to her in a group of exiting counselors and said, without stopping, his voice low and directed at her and carrying exactly as far as it needed to, "The Empire watched a king conquer 7 kingdoms. They will not follow a man who can't conquer himself." She let him move past her. She stood in the corridor and felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with the temperature and recognized it as the specific cold of knowing something that she would have preferred not to know. Kaelor was not positioning for an argument. He was positioning for a succession. And successions, in the history of empires, were rarely resolved through debate. She told Draven that evening. Not in the council chamber. Not in any of the formal spaces where walls had histories and architecture served politics. She told him in the training ground after the guards had rotated to the exterior posts, where the only audience was the dark and the cold, and the stars mostly hidden behind their winter cloud cover. "He's not trying to win an argument," she said. "He's building a case, the kind of case that doesn't need to be completed in council, the kind that just needs to exist loudly enough that when something happens, it already has an explanation in place." Draven was at the weapons rack, running a whetstone along a blade that was already sharp enough. She had noticed that he did this when he was thinking. The physical repetition of maintenance, hands occupied while the mind worked. "I know," he said. "You've known." "I've suspected," he said, "for longer than I should have allowed the suspicion to remain unresolved." "Why didn't you act on it?" The whetstone paused. "Because accusation without evidence is tyranny," he said. "Because I have seen what happens to rulers who move against rivals on the strength of suspicion. They become the thing they feared. They create the very disloyalty they were trying to prevent by making every man around them afraid of being suspected." A pause. "And because Kaelor is my father's blood, not a convenient enemy, someone I grew up with, someone I—" He stopped. She waited. "He changed," Draven said, "when he understood the succession structure. Something changed in him. I watched it happen, and I didn't act because I believed that men can choose what they become. I still believe that. It has simply become clear that Kaelor has made his choice." The whetstone resumed. "What do you need?" she said. He set the blade down. He turned and looked at her with the specific attention that she had learned to recognize as him deciding something. "I need to know when," he said. "The what and the who I can prepare for. But timing is the variable I cannot control. If your visions carry that information, they don't work on command," she said. "They arrive. I cannot summon them." "I know," he said, "but you can tell me when they do." "Yes," she said. He nodded. He picked up the blade and set it back on the rack with the deliberate care of a man completing a task. "You have been here 6 weeks," he said. His back was to her. 7, she said. A pause. 7 weeks, he said. "And the garrison in the lower city trusts you more than it trusted the last 3 physicians combined. And Marin has spoken more freely to you in 7 weeks than she has to anyone in 5 years. And the nobles who mocked you at the feast are now careful about which conversations they have in your presence." A pause. "That is not an accident." "No," she said. "You are doing it deliberately." "Yes." "Why?" he said. She considered the question honestly. "Because I arrived here without power," she said. "And power was the one thing that determined whether I survived or was consumed by the machinery of this court. And the only kind of power I know how to build is the kind built from being genuinely useful to people who can afford to be honest with me in return." A pause. "I am not managing you. I am telling you this because you asked and because I believe you have earned the accurate answer." He turned. The training ground. The dark. The particular quality of winter silence in a high-altitude fortress. "You are the most strategically honest person I have met in 11 years of ruling," he said. It was not a compliment dressed as an observation. It was an observation that carried the weight of an admission. She said, "You are the first person in 11 years of my life who asked." The wind came through the training ground from the North Pass, cold and direct, carrying with it the smell of snow still a few days away in the mountains. It stirred her hair. It did nothing to the scarred mass of the man in front of her because he was too settled in his own gravity to be moved by ordinary forces. They stood there in the cold for a moment that had no political purpose and served no strategic function and was simply itself. Then Draven said, "Come inside." And she did.
What about?
The vision came during the winter banquet in the 3rd month. She was seated at the high table with the full court assembled below, the hall bright with firelight and loud with the noise of several hundred people eating and the particular social theater that accompanied formal occasions in Blackspire. She was in conversation with a minister's wife about the southern trade routes when the room simply stopped. Not physically, not for anyone else. But for Seris, the banquet hall ceased to exist for approximately 30 seconds and was replaced by something she would spend the rest of the night trying to find words precise enough for: fire. Specifically fire on the eastern battlements. Not the gradual spread of fire from a burning building, but the sudden, simultaneous bloom of multiple fires, too coordinated to be accidental, arranged along the battlements in a pattern that a soldier would recognize as the work of prepared incendiary placements, set at intervals calculated to maximize coverage and minimize response time. Horns. The specific pattern of Blackspire's siege alarm, which she had memorized during her first week because she memorized everything that might be relevant to survival. And Kaelor. Standing in the courtyard below the eastern tower, not in armor, not in the defensive posture of a man managing a crisis. Standing in the posture of a man watching something he had paid for. Beside him, for 3 seconds before the vision fractured, a banner she had seen once in a classified archive that Marin had shown her without comment. The wolf and chain standard of the Veldrath Confederation, Frost Hollow's oldest enemy, a state that shared a border with Blackspire's eastern edge and had been technically at peace with the Empire for 18 years. Technically. She came back to the banquet hall with her hands gripping the edge of the table and her vision temporarily strobed with afterimage and the minister's wife staring at her with open alarm. "Lady Vale, I am well," she said. Her voice was level. Years of practice. She looked down the high table to where Draven sat in conversation with a general. She met his eyes. He read her expression in the way that people who have been paying genuinely careful attention to someone for months can read expressions. Completely and immediately and without error. He rose from his seat. And then the horns began. 3 blasts from the eastern battlement, then 2, then 3 again. The siege pattern. The hall erupted. Chairs, voices, the crash of overturned platters, and the scrape of blades clearing scabbards in the instinctive response of soldiers in a room full of soldiers. Draven was already moving. The general beside him was already moving. The entire formal architecture of the banquet dissolved into operational response in the time it took the 3rd echo of the horns to die against the citadel's stone walls. Seris was already standing. She had 1 second to make the decision about what kind of person she was in a crisis, about what the past 3 months had built in her, about whether survival meant shelter or action. She made it in the time it took to draw a breath. She went toward the screaming, not away from it. The healer's station was in the lower eastern corridor. She reached it before the first casualties did, collected 2 of the healers who were already there, and began directing the triage setup with the specific focused calm of someone who had practiced this in her mind every day for 3 months. Supplies. Positioning. The flow of injured through the space. Who was stable? Who was critical? Who was lost? The eastern wall was on fire. She could see it through the corridor's high windows, the orange bloom against the black sky, the shadows of defenders moving along the smoke-choked battlements. The sounds of Blackspire under siege were different from any description she had prepared herself with, louder in certain registers, quieter in others, with a particular resonance in the stone walls that transmitted impact through the floor and the ceiling and the air itself, a whole-body experience that her training had not adequately simulated. She worked, she focused. She did not allow herself to track the sounds from the eastern gate or calculate probabilities about how the battle was going, because the information was not available, and the calculation would not be accurate, and the available work required her complete attention. She was binding a sword wound on a young soldier's shoulder when the doorway to the corridor darkened. Draven. He was breathing hard. He had blood on his armor, other people's blood from the pattern and distribution of it, and his face was marked with soot and the particular cold fury of a man who has been fighting and is still fighting internally, even when the immediate physical fight has moved elsewhere. He looked at her. "I told you," he said, His voice was low and controlled, and the control was the tell, the specific restraint of a man managing an emotion that his operational posture did not permit him to display. "You told me to be careful," she said. "I was careful. I am in the healer's corridor with adequate protection on both entry points, and I have treated 11 people in the past hour, without which treatment several of them would have died." "You left safety," he said. "The healers needed coordination," she said. "I provided it. There are healers here who could—" "There were not enough," she said. "And I have specific skills that were needed. And I made a calculation, and I stand by it." He stared at her with an expression that was doing a great deal of work, anger and something underneath the anger that was not anger, something raw, the expression of a man who has discovered a fear he did not know he had by having it materialize in front of him. He crossed the corridor in 4 steps and took her face in his scarred hands with the same calculated gentleness he applied to blade correction in training, the touch of a man who understood the precise weight of his own strength. He looked at her face for one long moment. "You are not hurt," he said. "I am not hurt," she said. Something in his expression that had been locked shifted and went somewhere else. He released her. He stepped back. "The vision," he said. His voice had returned to operational flatness. "What did you see?" "Kaelor in the courtyard," she said. "Not armored, not in defensive position, watching." A pause. "And a Veldrath banner." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence, the silence of a man whose suspicion has become certainty, and whose certainty has arrived at a cost that the suspicion had not required him to pay yet. "Where is Kaelor now?" she said. Draven's jaw set. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely what I intend to find out." He turned toward the corridor's east exit. And in the shadows beyond the doorway, 20 feet away, in the smoke-edged dark of Blackspire under siege, a figure moved. Seris saw him first, Kaelor's face, lit for half a second by the orange bloom through the window above. His eyes met hers, and in those eyes she saw, with the awful clarity of the completely awake, that he was not retreating. He was arriving, and his hand was already moving toward the blade at his hip. Kaelor's hand moved toward the blade, and Seris had 2 seconds. She used one of them to confirm what she was seeing, the smoke-edged doorway. His face caught in the window fire, the deliberate, unhurried quality of the draw. Not the speed of a man attacking, but the certainty of a man who believed he had already won and was completing the formality. She used the second to speak. "Draven," one word. His name. The flat urgency of a voice transmitting critical information at maximum compression. He turned. What followed was not complicated. Draven crossed the corridor before Kaelor cleared the scabbard. His hand closed around the sword wrist, and the leverage he applied was the leverage of a man who had spent 4 decades learning exactly how bodies break. Not more force than required, not less. The precision of someone who had calculated this interval so many times that it had become instinct dressed as geometry. Kaelor hit the wall. The blade fell. Draven held him with one forearm across his chest, his face carrying an expression that was more frightening than rage. The absolute cold stillness of a man who has resolved something internally and is now operating on the far side of the resolution. Kaelor's breathing was fast and shallow. "This is not what it looks like," he said. Draven said nothing. The silence was worse than anything he could have said, because silence from a man like Draven is not absence. It is judgment without the mercy of words. "The Eastern assault was already in motion," Kaelor said. His voice found steadier register, the voice of a man executing a rehearsed version of this conversation. "I came here to—" "You drew on her," Draven said. "She is a spy." The accusation fell with the quality of a weapon deployed not because it is accurate, but because it is the only remaining option. A Silvermere agent. She has been feeding intelligence through the eastern trade route since she arrived. The garrison deterioration, the patrol gaps, she manufactured them. Draven's face did not change. "That is your position," he said. "It is the truth. And if you cannot see it, it is because she has done exactly what I am describing. Commander Ruth has documented communications." "Commander Ruth," Draven said, has been stationed in the central garrison for 6 months and has had no access to the Eastern Patrol reports. I reviewed the access records this morning. A pause. Before tonight, a fractional silence from Kaelor. The specific silence of a man discovering the scaffolding was already gone before the argument was needed. You have been watching me, Kaelor said. I have been watching everything, Draven said. That is what rulers do, the ones who survive. He released Kaelor's wrist, stepped back, looked at his cousin with the expression of a man who has already paid the emotional cost of a decision and is now simply on the far side of it. Where are the Veldrath commanders, he said. A long silence. There is a particular psychology in men who pursue power at the cost of everything else. A structure of self-justification so thoroughly constructed that it becomes indistinguishable from genuine belief. Kaelor had spent months building the internal case for what he was doing, layering argument over argument until the architecture felt not like ambition, but like necessity. Not betrayal, but correction. He had convinced himself, which is the most dangerous form of deception, because the deceiver has no distance from the lie. And now Draven's silence was dismantling that architecture stone by stone. Eastern approach, Kaelor said. Quiet now. The performance gone. 200 heavy infantry, waiting for a signal from the eastern tower. Green flare, 3 bursts. Draven looked at the soldier near the corridor entrance. Western wall, red flare, repeated twice. Alert the garrison that eastern infantry are holding position for a signal that will not come. Sir. The soldier was gone. Draven looked back at Kaelor. You had 100 ways to take what you wanted, he said. Not rage, genuine inquiry, the honest confusion of a man confronting a choice he cannot fully inhabit from the outside. Political challenge, alliance building. The succession has rules. You had time. Your father's name didn't win campaigns, Kaelor said. Your father's name didn't build the empire. No, Draven said. I did. I understand. The admission carried no bitterness, no performance of wound, which somehow landed harder than Fury would have. I built what I built, and you decided it should have been yours, Draven said. I know that feeling. I have seen it in every throne room I have ever entered, in every man who looked at another man's achievement and felt that the wrong person held it. A pause. The difference between ambition and betrayal is what you are willing to destroy to close the distance. Kaelor said nothing. What were you willing to destroy? Draven said. The silence that answered was complete. The silence of a man who could not answer that question and face himself at the same time. Everything. He had been willing to destroy everything. Eastern holding cells, Draven said. Separate guard, rotating. No visitors without my direct authorization. 2 soldiers materialized from the outer corridor. Kaelor walked between them without resistance. The particular quality of a man who has used up his available options and is now simply waiting to see what comes next. At the corridor's end, he stopped. You will need a harder heart than this to hold what you have built, he said. That is not a threat. It is an observation. I know, Draven said. Kaelor left. The corridor was quiet except for the siege sounds winding down outside. Reduced horn signals, the shift in fire quality from emergency to managed burn, the change in footstep patterns above that indicated organized response rather than crisis response. Draven stood with his back partially to Seris. Then he turned. She had been watching him throughout, watching for one specific thing, the moment when the controlled surface cracked under the weight of what had just happened. Because she understood by now that the control was real, and the emotion underneath it was real, and the relationship between them was not suppression, but management. The ongoing work of a man who had learned early and at high cost that a king who displays the full, unmediated force of his interior life has handed his enemies a map. He looked at her. He would have killed you, he said. Yes, she said, because you saw him. Because I saw him, and because I am the explanation that does not require his story to be true. If I am gone, the spy accusation stands. If the accusation stands, his case to the court has legs even after tonight. His jaw worked. She watched the calculation behind his eyes, not strategic calculation, which was already complete, but the other kind. The kind that has no name in the language of courts, because courts do not permit it to have a name. The calculation of a man who has just understood how close the thing he cannot afford to lose came to being gone. "You are not going to say anything," she said. "I'm trying to determine," he said, "whether it is possible to say what I want to say without it becoming a liability." "To whom?" she said. "To you," he said. She held that. "Say it anyway," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I have spent 11 years ensuring that nothing inside these walls could be used against me," he said. "Every attachment measured, every loyalty quantified. I did not allow myself the specific vulnerability of caring about outcomes for any individual person beyond their operational value." A pause. "I was wrong about what that cost." "What did it cost?" she said. "Everything that distinguishes a king from a tyrant," he said. "I only understand that now because you are standing in front of me and you should not be. And my response to that fact has been informative." From the eastern corridor came rapid footsteps. A runner, soot-stained and tight-faced. "My lord, General Sothane requests your presence at the eastern command post. Captured Veldrath officers. Negotiation questions." Draven looked at the runner, then at Seris. "Tell Sothane 10 minutes," he said. "Nothing preliminary without me." The runner retreated. Draven held her gaze for one more moment, the specific held moment of a man confirming that what he is leaving behind understands his departure is operational and not retreat. Then he was gone. She went back to her wounded. The dawn came gray over Blackspire, and Seris was still in the healer's hall when it arrived, her hands stained and her back carrying 6 hours of standing on stone. She had lost 2 of 11. A soldier whose internal injuries had been too progressed, a young gateman whose wound had appeared manageable until it was not. She had learned this in Silvermere. Medicine was not rescue. Medicine was odds management. Some odds were simply not in your favor, and the only response to that truth that was both honest and survivable was to do the work completely for every person in front of you and refuse to carry the dead into the room with the living. Marin arrived while she was cleaning instruments. "The council has been called," Marin said. "Full session, 3 hours." She paused. "The court is watching where you will be positioned when the official account is delivered, whether you are the queen who identified the threat or the foreign bride who was present when events occurred. The distinction matters significantly for what comes next." Seris dried her hands. "What is the honest read on what I am?" she said. Marin looked at her with the expression of a woman who has survived 30 years at Blackspire by knowing when something is worth saying. "That," Marin said, "is precisely what the king will answer this morning, whether he understands that or not." She left. Seris was at the council chamber door 40 minutes before the session began. The session was the most carefully weighted 3 hours she had witnessed at Blackspire. Draven entered carrying the post-operational qualities she had catalogued by now. Rested enough to be sharp, the focused energy of a man who had not slept but had spent the night doing work that is more restorative than sleep. He looked at her when he entered. She was in her observational position behind his chair. He gave a single nod, small and precise. She returned it. The council assembled with the careful energy of people who understood that what happened in this room would define the political architecture of Blackspire for the foreseeable future. The nobles who had known nothing performed their distance from guilt loudly. The ones who had known something found their seats without meeting eyes. Draven stood. The room quieted in the way it always quieted when he stood. Not the silence of instruction, but the silence of gravity. "Last night Blackspire survived an assault designed from within," he said. "The eastern vulnerabilities were manufactured. The patrol disruptions were coordinated. The Veldrath Confederation was given operational intelligence and offered territorial concessions in exchange for military support of a succession attempt." A pause. "The captured Veldrath officers have confirmed this in detail. Draven Thorne will be formally exiled. He will leave Frost Hollow territory within 30 days under military escort. His name is removed from the succession register. These actions are not subject to council input." General Sothane shifted in his seat. "The Veldrath withdrew intact. Their force is still on our eastern border. They have now assessed our vulnerabilities. That knowledge does not leave with them." "No," Draven said. "It does not. The eastern reinforcement question remains operational regardless of the succession resolution." "Yes." Draven paused. We will address it in consultation with the full intelligence picture of our Eastern vulnerabilities, which has been significantly updated in the past 12 hours. His eyes moved briefly to Seris, brief enough that half the room missed it, but the half that caught it included the people whose attention mattered, and she watched the recalibration move through their expressions with quiet efficiency. After the formal session, Draven held 4 senior generals for a separate meeting. He looked at Seris as the room cleared. She took a chair at the table. None of the generals said anything about it. Eastern reinforcement requires 3 months minimum, Sothane said, map on the table, voice carrying the blunt directness of a man who regarded political courtesy as time inefficiency. The Veldrath have 6 weeks of campaign weather before spring mud closes the passes. That is the window. 3 options, Draven said. Accelerated northern redeployment, which weakens the central position. Diplomatic engagement through the Trade Alliance framework, which Kaelor compromised but did not destroy. Or a demonstration of capability sufficient to change their cost-benefit assessment. A pause. I lean toward the diplomatic track as primary with demonstration as contingency. The diplomatic track requires a channel they trust, Sothane said. Our Eastern ambassador was Kaelor's appointment. His credibility is gone. A pause in the room. The specific pause of a group of people waiting for someone to name the thing they have already identified, but that requires a particular authorization to say aloud. The Silvermere Medical Archives, Seris said. The generals looked at her. Before the famine, Silvermere had active trade relationships with 3 provinces bordering the Veldrath Confederation, built on the exchange of medical knowledge. 2 of the Veldrath provincial governors were educated in the Silvermere tradition. She paused. I know both of them. I treated the younger one's daughter for a fever when I was 16. Sothane looked at Draven. Clean channel, Sothane said carefully. Kaelor had no access to it, not compromised. Yes, Draven said. That single word carried the weight of a decision already made. 3 days after the siege, Draven came to find her in the Eastern Garden. She had gone there for the same reason she had gone in her first week, to map geography, because mapping things was how she managed the space between what she knew and what she didn't. The garden was stripped to frost-killed root structures and iron lanterns, a low wall looking out toward the eastern approach, and the distant mountain line that the Veldrath forces had disappeared into. He appeared at the garden entrance and crossed toward her without the contained energy quality of a man managing the next operational demand. He moved with intention, the specific quality of someone who has decided something privately and is now completing the act publicly. He stopped beside her at the wall. They looked at the eastern approach together for a moment. The diplomatic channel requires your involvement, he said. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to conduct it as a political obligation, he said. I'm asking whether you are willing. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the mountains. His profile in the winter light showed the old scar along his jaw, and the particular set of his expression that was his version of open. Not performed, not soft, but present in the way that he was only present when he had decided the performance was less important than the accuracy. You are asking me, she said, not instructing me. Yes, he said. She held that. What changed? She said. He turned. 3 nights ago, he said, someone called my name in a burning corridor, and the reason that information reached me in the form it reached me, the form that allowed me to respond in the second I had to respond in, was that the person who called my name had spent 3 months learning exactly how to give me information in the compressed form that I actually receive it. A pause. That is not circumstance. That is a specific kind of care that I have not been given before. The wind came through the garden from the North Pass. Seris, he said. The use of her name without title was not incidental. She registered it with precision, as she registered everything, a deliberate marker of a shifted internal state, communicated in the only form he was capable of communicating it, without diminishing it through overconstruction. I am aware, he said, that you did not choose to come here, that the transaction that brought you to Blackspire was not one you negotiated. I am also aware that a transaction does not constitute the kind of foundation I am prepared to build something on. He stopped. The jaw muscle worked. I am not a man who speaks in this register without cost. I am telling you this because I believe you are owed accurate information about the state of what I intend. The garden was very still. She thought about the ring on her finger, cold when he placed it, warm to her temperature within a day. She thought about the cloak placed over her sleeping body, the fruit reserved for nobility that appeared with her evening meals, the corridor in the burning citadel, and his hands on her face, checking that she was not hurt with the specific attention of someone for whom the answer to that question mattered in a way that had nothing to do with operational continuity. "I came here as the price of grain," she said. "I arrived intending to survive this place and be useful to Silvermere, and I intended to manage whatever relationship was required with the same methodical attention I apply to everything." She met his eyes. "I was not planning for the possibility that the relationship would require me to revise what I believed about what I was capable of feeling inside these walls." He looked at her, and in his face, in the specific quality of his expression in that moment, she saw the thing she had been watching for since the corridor outside the healer's hall. Not a crack in the controlled surface, an opening, a door in a wall that had been built deliberately and maintained rigorously and had decided for the first time in a very long time to function as a door rather than simply a wall. He reached out. His hand, scarred, large, careful, came to rest against her jaw the way he had held her face after the siege. Not possessive, not soft, but present in the way a gravitational field is present, simply itself, and therefore organizing everything around it. She put her hand over his. They stood in the dead winter garden with the eastern mountains behind them and the cold pressing in from every direction, and neither of them said anything for a moment that had no political content and served no strategic function and was simply itself. Then a horn sounded from the western tower. Single note. Priority courier signal. Draven's hand dropped. He looked toward the sound. "I know the signal," she said. He held her gaze once more. Then he walked toward the garden exit with the purposeful quality of a king returning to his kingdom, not snapping back, not shutting the door that had just opened, but returning to the work that was always there. She stayed at the wall another minute, looking at the eastern mountains, the mountains that had carried his enemies toward him, the mountains his enemies had retreated back into, the mountains that were currently calculating, in the cold and unhurried way of strategic actors, whether the window of opportunity had closed or merely narrowed. She already knew the answer. It had narrowed, but narrowed was not closed. She left the garden and walked toward the main reception hall where the courier was waiting, already certain from the priority designation that this was not a routine dispatch. The administrative code she had memorized in her first week at Blackspire reserved that particular signal for one category of communication: diplomatic correspondence from border territories. The courier was young, travel-worn in the way of someone who had been riding for 3 days without significant rest. He was carrying a sealed dispatch in the colors of the Eastern Trade Council. He was also carrying, in the partially open satchel beside him, a second document, a document in a color she had last seen in the sealed section of Silvermere's political archives, the section Lord Aldrich had kept behind 2 locks and had never once shown her directly. The color of the Veldrath Confederation's internal diplomatic correspondence. She stopped in the doorway. The courier looked up. Draven entered from the opposite door. She understood in the 3 seconds before he reached the courier that the document in that satchel did not contain a withdrawal confirmation. It contained terms, and whatever was written inside had been written before the assault began, before the eastern gates burned, before Kaelor was taken, before any of last night had played out. Which meant the Veldrath had planned for failure, which meant the assault on Blackspire had not been their real move. It had been a test designed to measure one specific variable, not the strength of the walls, not the speed of the garrison response, not the depth of the eastern defenses. The test had been measuring Draven, and the document in that satchel contained their assessment of what they had learned. She looked at Draven. He looked at the satchel. Then he looked at her, and in his expression was the particular quality of a man who has just understood that the war he thought he finished last night has not finished at all. It has simply entered a new phase that neither of them has fully mapped yet. He reached for the document, and the seal on the Veldrath correspondence was not the standard diplomatic seal. It was stamped with a second mark beneath the Confederation's wolf and chain, a mark that Seris recognized from the medical archives, from the sealed correspondence her father had kept during Silvermere's final political collapse. Correspondence that he had told her was above her clearance, but whose seal she had photographed with the precise visual memory she had developed for exactly this kind of contingency. The mark of the Veldrath High Commander. The man who did not send letters. The man who only wrote when he was prepared to end something, or begin something that could not be undone. Draven broke the seal. The sound it made was small, wax cracking under thumb pressure, the specific clean snap of a seal that had been set with care and applied with the deliberate weight of someone who understood that the document it protected was not routine correspondence. The courier had retreated to the far wall with the professional discretion of a man trained to be absent while present, and the reception hall held only the three of them, Draven, Seris, and the letter from a man who did not write letters. Draven read. She watched his face. She had learned his face across 3 months of paying the kind of attention that people pay when their survival depends on accurate reading of a single human being's internal states. She had cataloged the specific muscle responses that indicated genuine surprise versus processed information that had been expected. She had mapped the difference between the jaw set of contained anger and the jaw set of contained grief. She had learned that his eyes changed quality when he was managing something real rather than performing the management of something real. What she saw now was none of those things. What she saw was a man reading something that was reorganizing the architecture of his understanding at a structural level, not updating a detail, not revising an assessment, but discovering that the foundation he had been building on was not what he believed it to be. He read the letter twice. Then he set it on the table with the deliberate, careful movement of a man placing something explosive on a flat surface. He looked at her. The Veldrath High Commander, he said, has been in direct correspondence with Silvermere's senior minister for 14 months. The reception hall was very quiet. Lord Aldrich, she said. Lord Aldrich, he said. She absorbed that. She absorbed it the way she absorbed things that were going to take time to fully process, by registering the shape of it first, the outline, the weight, before attempting the interior. Because the interior of this particular piece of information contained implications that she was not yet equipped to look at directly. Lord Aldrich had delivered the sentence that defined her situation. Lord Aldrich had organized the convoy. Lord Aldrich had chosen the silver morning silk and written the note about tribute bride traditions that she had burned in her small fire because some insults deserved that particular response. Lord Aldrich had been writing to the Veldrath High Commander for 14 months, which meant the arrangement predated the famine's worst period, which meant the arrangement predated the political collapse that had made Silvermere desperate enough to trade a lord's daughter for grain and military protection, which meant the desperation may not have been as organic as it appeared. What does he want? She said. Her voice was level. She was aware of it being level with the specific awareness of a person monitoring their own responses and finding the monitoring harder than usual. Draven picked up the letter. Read a section aloud with the flat, precise delivery of a man reading intelligence rather than communicating it. The arrangement proposed by Lord Aldrich of Silvermere in exchange for Veldrath military withdrawal and a 10-year non-aggression framework requires the following. The removal of Seris Vale from Blackspire Citadel to be returned to Silvermere's custody within 30 days, and the nullification of the ceremonial binding conducted in the 3rd month of this year. The words landed in the reception hall with the particular weight of information that changes the shape of everything preceding it. He sold me twice, she said. Draven looked at her. First to you, she said. Now back. She heard her own voice say it and recognized the quality of it. Not wounded, not performed, but the flat, stripped-back register of a person who has had the architecture of their understanding knocked out from under them and is currently standing in the air where the floor used to be, moving on instinct while the mind catches up. There is a specific kind of betrayal that arrives not as a single blow, but as a revelation of structure. The understanding that what you experienced as a sequence of unfortunate events was in fact a designed system, that the hands you thought were responding to circumstances were the hands that created those circumstances, that your suffering was not collateral damage but intended output. This kind of betrayal does not feel like being hit. It feels like looking at a map you have been navigating for months and realizing the landmarks were placed there by the person who wanted you lost. Seris had been navigating that map for 3 months, possibly for much longer. The famine, she said. The letter does not address causation, Draven said carefully. The famine accelerated faster than it should have, she said. I was there. I watched the grain stores decline and the distribution fail, and I attributed it to infrastructure collapse and political incompetence because those were present and sufficient, and I did not look further. She paused. Aldrich controlled the distribution records. Draven said nothing. He manufactured the desperation, she said, or he accelerated it, sufficient to make the transaction plausible, sufficient to make Silvermere's court agree that trading a lord's daughter was reasonable policy. She felt something cold moving through her that was not the winter temperature and was not grief and was not anger, exactly, but was the specific cold of a person understanding the full scope of what was done to them and to how many people it was done in order to position her here. How many people died in Silvermere's famine that did not have to die? The question was not directed at Draven, it was directed at the air, at the particular space where Aldrich's deliberate calculations had intersected with the lives of people who had no idea they were inside someone else's designed system. Draven picked up the letter again. Not to read it. To hold it. The way a man holds evidence while deciding what it requires of him. The Veldrath withdrawal is contingent on compliance within 30 days, he said. If compliance is not confirmed, the letter indicates a second military option is already positioned. Not the eastern approach, he paused. The northern pass. She looked at him. How many? She said. The letter does not specify. Sothan's assessment of the northern pass in winter conditions suggests a minimum of 400 effective infantry if they have adequate cold weather equipment, which the Veldrath northern units do. A pause. We cannot reinforce the northern approach and maintain eastern defensive sufficiency simultaneously, not in the current deployment state. There it was. The shape of the trap completed itself. Kaler's assault had not been the primary mechanism. It had been the instrument that depleted Blackspire's immediate response capacity, that distracted the command structure, that created the specific operational exhaustion that made the follow-on threat credible. The Veldrath had not expected Kaler to succeed. They had expected him to weaken. And into that weakness, a letter arrives from a man who has been running a 14-month operation that Blackspire never detected, containing terms that Blackspire cannot afford to refuse and cannot afford to accept. He is testing whether you love me more than you can afford to, Seris said. The word came out of her mouth before she had decided to use it, and she did not take it back because taking it back would have been less accurate than leaving it. Draven looked at her. Yes, he said. Because if you do, she said, and you refuse the terms, and the northern assault comes, and Blackspire bleeds for it, the court that just watched you name me queen in the council chamber will conclude that the woman was the cause. That Kaler was right. That you chose personal attachment over strategic clarity, and the Empire paid the price. She paused. And if you accept the terms, you demonstrate to every border territory, every rival house, and every man in your garrison that Blackspire can be leveraged through a single vulnerability. You demonstrate that the Iron Alpha has a price. The reception hall, the winter light through the high windows, the letter on the table between them. There is a third reading, Draven said. Yes, she said. There is. Aldrich believes this works because he believes that what exists between us is recent enough and uncertain enough that I will calculate it as expendable against existential military threat. Draven's voice was flat and precise, the operational register carrying weight that the operational register was not designed to carry. He is wrong about the calculation. She looked at him. That is the most consequential statement you have made in my presence, she said. Yes, he said. I am aware. She turned away from the table. She walked to the window. She looked out at the inner courtyard where Blackspire's garrison was moving through the post-siege reorganization. Soldiers and equipment and the ordinary operational momentum of a military structure returning itself to readiness. Men with families in the lower city. Men who had bled on the eastern wall 3 nights ago. Men who would bleed on the northern pass if the Veldrath moved. This was the specific weight that power placed on personal feeling. Not the abstract moral calculation of politics, but the concrete embodied weight of understanding that every decision you make in a room like this one is paid for by people who will never be in the room. The soldiers in the courtyard did not know about the letter. They did not know that their operational future was currently being determined by the intersection of a 14-month conspiracy and a 3-month marriage and whatever existed between 2 people standing at a window in the winter light. They did not know, but they would pay regardless. This is what it means to hold power. Not the authority to command, which is easy. Any man with enough force behind him can command. The weight of power is the understanding that your private choices have public consequences that you cannot fully predict and cannot fully control and cannot take back once they have been set in motion. Every king who ever lived in the long history of human governance has faced some version of this specific room, this specific letter, this specific impossible arithmetic of what you are willing to cost the people who did not choose to be part of your calculation. The ones who became tyrants resolved the arithmetic by deciding the people in the courtyard did not matter as much as the continuation of their own position. The ones who became legends resolved it by deciding their own position did not matter as much as the people in the courtyard. The ones who survived long enough to be neither tyrant nor legend resolved it by finding a third option that neither extreme had considered. Seris turned from the window. "I need to see Kaelor," she said. Draven's expression shifted. "No." "I need to see him," she said again. "Before you respond to this letter, before any military assessment, before the council is briefed. Kaelor has no useful information that he has been in communication with Aldrich," she said. A pause. "The letter does not indicate—" "The letter is from the Veldrath High Commander," she said, "who does not write letters, who communicated through Aldrich, who trusted Aldrich sufficiently to build a 14-month operation on his intelligence." She held Draven's gaze. "Aldrich is Silvermere's senior minister. He has no direct channel to the Veldrath. He needed an intermediary who had established Eastern contacts, someone who had been building relationships in the Eastern territories for years, cultivating alliances that fell outside Blackspire's official diplomatic record." She paused. "Who had access to the Eastern Patrol records? Who controlled the garrison assignment structure?" Draven went very still. "Kaelor was not Aldrich's instrument," she said. "Aldrich was Kaelor's. Or they were running parallel operations that found each other at the intersection." She paused. "Which means Kaelor knows things about Aldrich's operation that are not in that letter. Things about the timeline. Things about the mechanisms. Things about what other options Aldrich has if this one fails." The silence was the silence of a man processing information that was changing the shape of his strategic picture in real time. "10 minutes, Draven said finally. "I will be present." "No," she said. He looked at her. "He will perform for you," she said. "He will calculate. He will determine what you need to believe, and he will construct the version of the truth that serves that belief. He has spent years learning the architecture of your responses." She held his gaze with the specific steadiness of a woman who understands that what she is asking requires a quality of trust that has not yet been formally established and is being asked for anyway. He has not spent years learning mine, the longest pause of the morning. 5 minutes, Draven said. "Guard at the door. Open." She went. The Eastern holding cell was not a dungeon in any theatrical sense. It was a stone room with a barred window that let in cold light, and a cot and a chair, and the particular quality of air in enclosed spaces that have been occupied by someone for several days, close and warm, and carrying the smell of a person who has been living inside their own thoughts without distraction. Kaelor was sitting on the cot when the guard opened the door. He looked up. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. She was not what he had expected, which told her that he had been expecting someone and that she had arrived at a time when his preparation was calibrated for a different interrogation. "Lady Vale," he said. "Seris," she said. "We are past the formal register." She crossed the room and sat in the chair. She sat with the deliberate, unhurried quality of a person who is not performing composure but is genuinely composed, which is a different thing and produces a different effect on the person being observed. Kaelor watched her with the specific wariness of a man who has spent his available thinking time running scenarios and is currently determining which scenario has just walked through the door. "You received the letter," he said. "Yes," she said. "Then you know what Aldrich wants." "I know what the letter says he wants," she said. "I am here to understand what he actually wants. Because men who run 14-month operations do not tip their hand in the opening correspondence unless they want you focused on the opening move while the real move happens somewhere else." Kaelor was quiet. She watched his face the way she watched things she needed to understand completely, without the rush of interpretation, letting the information present itself in its own time. You introduced them, she said, Aldrich and the Veldrath connection. It was not the other way around. A fractional pause. Then, not denying, Aldrich came to me 2 years ago. He had already identified the Veldrath's interest in the eastern border realignment. He needed someone who could formalize the channel without triggering Blackspire's diplomatic monitoring. A pause. I needed someone with the kind of reach into Silvermere's grain records that could create the conditions I required. You needed Draven to take a bride, she said. I needed Draven to demonstrate a vulnerability, Kaler said. A bride was one mechanism. The more important mechanism was the dependency it would create. A king who accepts a political marriage to stabilize a broken province has admitted publicly that his empire has limits he cannot manage through military means alone. A pause. I did not anticipate the specific nature of what developed. What did you anticipate? She said. A transaction, he said. Cold management. The kind of arranged relationship that produces political stability and nothing else. The kind that gives enemies exactly the leverage they need. A hostage dressed as a wife, positioned close enough to the center of power to be consequential when pressure is applied. He looked at her. You were supposed to remain a transaction. She held that. And Aldrich, she said. What does he actually want? Not what is written in the letter. Kaler looked at the barred window for a moment. Aldrich does not want you back, he said. Aldrich wants Blackspire's Eastern Grain Distribution Network, the system Draven built quietly over the past decade, the one that has been feeding the northern provinces through hard winters without official acknowledgement. A pause. Silvermere's collapse was not entirely organic. You were correct about the acceleration, but Aldrich did not accelerate it to position you here. He accelerated it because a starving province is a province whose population will follow whoever feeds them, and whoever controls the grain controls the allegiance. He paused. He wanted to rebuild Silvermere's political base under his own authority, rather than a functioning lord's. The famine cleared the old hierarchy. He needed the resources to establish the new one. He needed Blackspire's distribution infrastructure, she said. He needed the methodology, Kaler said. The roots, the supplier relationships, the administrative structure that makes it function without central announcement. He paused. Your return would be the demonstration payment. Proof that Blackspire bends to pressure applied at the correct point. Proof that the system can be leveraged. Once that proof exists, the actual terms become negotiable. She sat with that for 3 seconds. He does not expect Draven to comply, she said. Kaler looked at her. No, he said. He expects Draven to refuse. The northern assault is the actual plan. You are the demonstration of the vulnerability. The assault is the mechanism that creates the political crisis inside Blackspire that removes Draven and puts someone more manageable in position. A pause. The court has already heard the accusation that Draven chose personal attachment over strategic clarity. If the northern pass bleeds because he refused to surrender you, that accusation becomes evidence. She stood. Who is the manageable candidate? She said. Kaler said nothing. She looked at him. I am already exiled, he said finally. My name is off the register. I have nothing left to protect by withholding. Then tell me, she said. General Sothane, Kaler said. Aldrich's correspondence with him began 6 months ago, before my operation was compromised, before last night. The floor of the room did not move. She was aware that it did not move because she was aware of every physical detail of the space with the hyper-clarity of a mind that has just received information that requires it to immediately reconstruct everything it thought it understood. Sothane, who had managed the Veldrath withdrawal, who had been in the command meeting, who had been present when Seris identified the clean diplomatic channel through Silvermere, who had confirmed in front of Draven that the channel was not compromised, who now knew exactly which channel Blackspire intended to use. She walked to the door. Seris, Kaler said. She stopped. I am telling you this because Aldrich used me and burned the architecture I spent years building to protect an operation I was not fully informed of, he said. I am not reformed. I am not asking for clemency. I am telling you because the enemy of my enemy is the only currency I have left, and I am spending it accurately." She looked back at him. "I know," she said. She left the cell at a pace that was not quite running. She found Draven in the command corridor outside the main strategy room, in conference with two of the senior garrison officers. She crossed the corridor toward him with the specific quality of movement that he had learned to read. She had observed him reading it, had seen the way his attention sharpened when she moved with that particular combination of controlled speed and directional certainty. He excused the officers in 4 words, and they were gone before she reached him. She told him in the compressed, precise form that she had developed across 3 months of learning how he received information. The essential structure first, the supporting detail second, the implication third. No preamble, no softening. Sothane, 6 months. Aldrich's correspondence. The clean channel that Sothane had just confirmed was uncompromised. Draven's face did the thing she had never seen it do before. It went blank. Not the controlled blankness of managed response. The specific blankness of a man whose internal processing has exceeded the capacity of his surface management for one unguarded moment. The blankness of genuine shock, arriving in the face of a man who had believed, across 11 years of ruling an empire built on vigilance, that he had identified every variable worth watching. Sothane had been in the command structure for 9 years. He had fought in 4 campaigns. He had been present at the Eastern Defense 3 nights ago. He had been in the room when the intelligence picture was presented. He had confirmed the diplomatic channel was clean. He had known, in that moment, that the channel ran through Sarah's Silvermere connections. He had known, which meant Aldrich had known within hours, which meant every move Blackspire had made since the letter arrived had been visible. The specific quality of betrayal that comes from inside the command structure is different from any other kind. External enemies are manageable because their hostility is legible. Their motivations are comprehensible. Their movements can be mapped and countered with sufficient intelligence. But the man who sits at your council table and speaks in the language of loyalty while operating inside the architecture of your trust, that man does not need to attack the walls. He is already inside them. He has been inside them for months, walking your corridors and eating at your table and watching your face during strategy sessions with the compound attention of a person who is simultaneously assessing and reporting. This is the specific vulnerability of power, not the enemies outside the gates who announce themselves through hostility. The ones who arrive as allies and remain as instruments of someone else's design. The ones whose betrayal, when it comes, does not feel like enemy action. It feels like the floor disappearing. Every ruler who has ever held significant power has eventually learned this lesson. The ones who learn it early enough survive. The ones who learn it too late become the explanation that historians use when discussing why empires fall. Draven's blankness lasted 3 seconds. Then something came back into his face that was colder and more resolved than anything she had seen there before. Not rage. Rage was reactive. What came back into his face was the expression of a man who has located the final variable he needed and is now completing a calculation that has been running for weeks. "Where is Sothane now, Schwab?" he said. "He requested a perimeter assessment of the northern approach this morning," she said. "He left the Citadel 2 hours ago with a 4-man escort." Draven looked at her. "He is not doing a perimeter assessment," she said. "No," Draven said. "He is not. He was signaling, delivering confirmation that the diplomatic channel was identified, delivering whatever additional intelligence he had gathered from the command meeting, delivering it in person, which meant the Veldrath northern position was close enough for a 2-hour ride, which meant it was not a theoretical threat position for political leverage. It was a force already in position, already supplied, already briefed, waiting for the signal that told them Blackspire's internal disruption had reached the point of maximum vulnerability. "How long?" Draven said. "If he is signaling now," she said, "and they are positioned where the 2-hour radius suggests, and they move at standard winter campaign pace through the northern pass." She did the arithmetic that she had been building towards since the moment Kaelor spoke Sothane's name. 18 hours, perhaps 20 if the pass conditions have degraded overnight. 18 hours. The full shape of the trap was visible now, in its completed form, and it was elegant in the cold and inhuman way that well-constructed traps are elegant, not despite the suffering they were designed to cause, but incorporating that suffering as a functional element. Kaelor's assault had depleted the garrison's immediate response capacity and created the political fracture that made Draven's judgment questionable. Aldrich's letter had presented terms that forced the choice between personal cost and strategic cost in public view. Sothane's position inside the command structure had ensured that every countermove was visible before it could be completed, and the northern force already in position was the consequence that arrived regardless of which choice was made. Comply and demonstrate that the Empire bends to this kind of pressure, inviting every future application of the same mechanism. Refuse and bleed on the northern pass in a battle that the court had already been primed to read as the consequence of a king's compromised judgment. Either outcome advanced the same objective. This was the work of a 14-month operation designed by people who understood that the most reliable way to break a thing built on strength was not to attack the strength directly. It was to find the specific geometry where strength and vulnerability occupied the same space and apply pressure exactly there. They had found it, and they had built their entire operation around it. Seris looked at Draven. He looked at her. They were standing in the command corridor of Blackspire Citadel, with 18 hours before a force hit the northern pass, a compromised command structure, a diplomatic channel that was now burned before it had been used, and a letter on the reception hall table that had been designed to be impossible to answer correctly. "What do you need?" she said. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has spent 11 years making decisions alone and is standing at the first moment where he is genuinely asking himself whether that was a choice or simply the only option he had available at the time. "I need you to tell me," he said, "whether the Silvermere Channel is completely burned or whether there's a version of it that Sothane did not have full visibility into." She thought about it. Not performing thought, actually working through the architecture of what she had told Sothane, what she had revealed in the command meeting, what detail had been present in that room, and what detail had been held back, either by design or by the simple incompleteness of any intelligence assessment. There was one thing. One name she had not mentioned in the command meeting because it had not seemed relevant at the level of strategic overview. A name that Sothane therefore did not have. A name that existed in the Silvermere connection at a level below the provincial governors she had identified publicly. A healer. A woman who had trained in the same tradition as Sarah's father. A woman who now lived in the border settlement closest to the Veldrath Southern Command. A woman whose value was not in her political position, but in the fact that she had been treating the Veldrath High Commander's wife for a joint illness for 3 years, which meant she had access that no diplomat had, and a relationship that no military pressure could replicate. Seris had not mentioned her because she had not been certain the relationship was still intact after Silvermere's collapse, and because introducing an unverified asset into a strategic conversation was, in her estimation, premature. It was no longer premature. "Yes," she said, "there is a version Sothane did not see." Draven held her gaze. "Then we have one option," he said. "One channel, one window, and it requires moving before Sothane reaches the Veldrath position." He paused. "It also requires sending you outside the Citadel, toward the Veldrath Southern Command, in the next 3 hours, with the kind of escort that is small enough to move fast and visible enough to signal that you are not running." She understood what he was not saying. What he was not saying was that if Sothane reached the Veldrath position before she reached the border settlement, the channel would close before it opened and the northern assault would begin on a timeline that Blackspire could not fully counter, and every variable that Aldrich had calculated would resolve in his favor. What he was not saying was that he was asking her to walk toward the people who had been planning to use her as the pressure point for this entire operation. What he was not saying was that he was asking her because she was the only person who could do it, and because asking was what he had decided he was going to do instead of instructing. And that decision was itself a kind of answer to everything the past 3 months had been building toward. She was standing in a burning corridor again, in the metaphorical sense that mattered, the specific moment where the choice was not between safety and danger, but between the version of yourself that retreats to the calculable and the version that steps into the space where the calculation runs out and something else has to take over. She had made this choice before. She knew what it cost. She knew what it was worth. "Tell me the escort composition," she said. And Draven's face, for one unguarded moment, showed her the thing that all his armor had been built to protect. Not weakness, as the court would have named it, but the specific and costly and irreplaceable quality of a man who has allowed something to matter to him in the full knowledge of what that means in a world that treats the things you love as leverage. It was the most human thing she had ever seen him do, and it was the moment she understood, with the precision she brought to everything she truly understood, that there was no version of what came next that she was willing to navigate without him, which meant there was no version of what came next that she was willing to lose. She took the 3 steps toward him and put her hand flat against his chest, over the old armor, over the older scars, and looked up at him with the specific directness of a woman who has decided that accuracy is more important than timing. "I will go," she said, "and I will come back. And when I come back, this empire will have earned a different kind of story than the one Aldrich wrote for it." She held his gaze. "But you're going to have to trust me in a way that has nothing to do with strategy, and I am going to have to trust that the man who asked instead of instructed means it." His hand came up and covered hers. "Go," he said. Quiet. The word carrying every weight that the word could carry. She went. And behind her, Blackspire Citadel, the empire of volcanic stone and old wars, and the weight of 11 years of calculated survival, prepared itself for the next 18 hours with the specific grim readiness of a fortress that has survived everything it has faced so far, not by being invulnerable, but by refusing to be finished. The question that no fortress, no empire, and no man could fully answer in advance was whether that refusal was going to be enough this time. The Northern Pass was already waiting for the answer. The Northern Pass in winter had a specific quality of silence that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. There was sound, wind through the rock corridors, the creak of ice under pressure, the distant percussion of frozen water moving in ways that water should not move in these temperatures, all the active noise of a landscape that was doing violence to itself constantly and quietly. But underneath that noise was a silence of a different kind, the silence of held breath, the silence of 400 men in cold weather equipment standing in organized stillness on the approach to a pass that led directly to Blackspire's least defended northern wall, waiting for a signal that had been 12 hours coming and had not yet arrived. Seris was aware of them the way she was aware of everything that she had not yet confirmed, as a weight in the calculation, a variable whose precise value was unknown, but whose general magnitude was not. She rode with 5 soldiers, not a military escort in any impressive sense, a scout formation, moving fast and low through the terrain that connected Blackspire's eastern approach to the border settlement, where a woman named Kala had been treating a Veldrath commander's wife for 3 years without ever being asked about her political allegiances. Political allegiances were not a language that healers spoke fluently. They spoke the language of bodies, of illness, of the specific gratitude that develops between a person in pain and the person who relieves that pain consistently and without judgment. It was the oldest relationship in the world, and it operated below the level of states and borders and letters sealed with commanders' marks. Seris was betting the Northern Pass on it. She was also betting on the 12-hour window between Sothane's departure and the Veldrath force's earliest viable movement through the pass. 12 hours was not generous. 12 hours assumed no complications, no delays, no variables she had not yet identified. 12 hours assumed that Kala was still in the border settlement and still had the access she had possessed 6 months ago when Seris last had reliable intelligence about her location. Intelligence gathered not through official channels, but through the healer network that continued to operate across political boundaries because illness did not observe treaty lines. The ride took 4 hours. 4 hours through terrain that the winter had made specific and unforgiving. A landscape that gave no concessions to urgency, where the horse's footing was a constant negotiation with ice and hidden drop-offs, and the particular treachery of paths that looked solid and were not. Seris rode in the specific internal state she had developed across years of working in crisis conditions, present in the body, aware of the physical environment at the level of instinct, while a parallel process in her mind ran the variables she could not afford to stop processing just because the terrain demanded her attention. She thought about Draven, back at Blackspire, not in the way of sentiment, which was a luxury the timeline did not permit. She thought about him operationally, about what he was doing in the hours she was not there, about the specific quality of his decision-making when operating without the intelligence function she had developed for him across the past 3 months, about whether the command structure, stripped of Sothane and reorganized under the emergency authority that Draven would have established the moment she left, was sufficient to hold the eastern approach while the northern threat developed. About whether 18 hours was still the timeline or whether Sothane's early signal had compressed it. She did not think about whether she would come back. That variable was not productive. Kala's settlement appeared at the base of a valley that the mountains had shaped into a natural shelter. One of the border communities that existed in the geographic ambiguity between formal territories, populated by people who had made their peace with living in the space where one state's authority blurred into another's, and had discovered that this ambiguity, properly managed, was not a liability but a form of freedom. Seris dismounted at the settlement's edge and walked the last 100 yards alone. The 5 soldiers held position on the ridge. She had told them to come down if she was not back in 90 minutes, and she had not told them what to do after that because the 90-minute plan was the extent of what she was certain about. She found Kala in the settlement's single medical building, which was not impressive from the outside and contained on the inside the organized chaos of a working healer's space, the specific productive disorder of someone who knew exactly where everything was and had no interest in the opinions of people who valued aesthetics over function. Kala was 60 years old and had been practicing medicine in this settlement for 23 years and had the specific quality of a person who had decided, at some point in the past, that fear was a resource she could not afford and had found something else to run on instead. She looked up when Seris entered, recognized her after a moment that accounted for 3 years of changed appearance, and said, "You look like you rode 4 hours in this weather without adequate preparation." "I need access to the Veldrath High Commander," Seris said. Kala set down what she was holding. She looked at Seris for a long moment with the complete, unhurried attention of someone who has learned that the first sentence out of a person's mouth in a crisis is rarely the most important thing they have to say, but is always the most important thing they have to say at that specific moment. "His wife is here," Kala said. Seris had not expected that. "She came 3 days ago," Kala said. "The joint illness progressed faster than the winter timeline suggested it would." He brought her himself. A pause. "He is in the settlement." The specific quality of a variable resolving itself in unexpected proximity. "Where?" Seris said. The Veldrath High Commander's name was Vorath, and he was 62 years old, and he had the build of a man who had spent 4 decades in cold-weather military operations, and the face of a man who had made enough difficult decisions that the decisions had become visible in the topography of his expression. Not hardness for its own sake, but the specific weathered quality of a person who has learned to live with the cost of the choices that needed to be made. He was sitting outside the building where his wife was being treated, in the cold that he seemed not to notice, when Seris walked toward him with the 5 settlement minutes of preparation that was all the time she had. He looked at her when she was still 10 feet away. "Seris Vale," he said. "Not a question." "You know who I am," she said. "You have Aldrich's coloring," he said, "and you move like someone who has been inside a military command structure recently. That combination is not common." He looked at her with the assessing quality of a man reading information. "Aldrich told me you would not come. He said Draven Thorne would keep you inside Blackspire as leverage against exactly this kind of approach." "Aldrich told you what he needed you to believe about Draven's decision-making," she said. "He was wrong." Vorath was quiet. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "My force is 12 hours from the pass," he said. "My arrangement with Aldrich was specific. The northern assault proceeds when Sothane confirms that Blackspire's command structure has been sufficiently disrupted to make the defense untenable." He paused. "Sothane's signal arrived 2 hours ago." She felt the timeline compress around that information like a physical thing. "Then you know Sothane has been burned," she said. Vorath looked at her. "Kaelor talked," she said. "Sothane is not inside Blackspire's command structure anymore. He is in a holding cell. The signal he sent you is the last communication he was capable of making, and it was sent before Draven knew his identity. Everything Sothane told you about Blackspire's defensive position is information from before the command restructuring that happened in the past 6 hours." She held Vorath's gaze. "You are operating on intelligence that is already obsolete." A silence. "You came here to tell me my intelligence is bad," he said, "and to ask me to stand down." "I came here to offer you something better than what Aldrich offered you," she said. "Aldrich offered me the eastern border realignment, 3 provinces, treaty framework for 20 years. Aldrich offered you territory he does not control, and a treaty framework backed by a man who has just been exposed as the architect of a failed double operation, she said. Kaelor is exiled. Sothane is in a cell. Aldrich's mechanism inside Blackspire does not exist anymore. Whatever he promised you was contingent on internal disruption that has been contained. She paused. You move 400 men through the northern pass today, and you will hit a command structure that has been reorganized in the past 6 hours, specifically because Draven knows the attack is coming. You will hit the northern wall at full alert with a depleted assault force that has been moving through pass conditions for 12 hours. She let that sit. That is not the operation Aldrich sold you. Varath looked at the medical building where his wife was. There is a particular calculation that military men make when they have committed significant resources to an operation and receive information mid-execution that materially changes the cost-benefit. It is not the calculation of cowardice, which is the assessment of personal danger, but the calculation of a commander who understands that the purpose of military force is the achievement of objectives, and that force applied to objectives that have changed is not courage, but waste. The men in the past were not symbols. They were men. 400 of them, with families and cold feet, and the particular fatigue of people who have been in position for 72 hours waiting for a signal. What are you offering? Voreth said. The Silvermere Medical Archive, she said. Everything in it. The methodology, the supplier relationships, the administrative structure for the grain distribution system that has been keeping Blackspire's northern provinces alive through hard winters. She paused. Directly. No intermediary. Backed by a formal treaty between Blackspire and the Veldrath Confederation that does not require either party to have compromised the other's command structure to make it function. Vorath looked at her. Draven Thorne authorized this, he said. Draven Thorne trusted me to make the offer that served both empires better than the war Aldrich designed for us, she said. That is not the same thing, but it is more valuable than authorization. The wind came through the settlement from the mountain direction, cold and specific. I want to meet him, Vorath said. Then call your force back from the pass, she said, and I will bring him to the table. She was back on the horse inside 20 minutes. The ride back was harder than the ride out. The weather had shifted in the way of northern mountain weather, moving from cold clarity to something wetter and angrier, sleet beginning in the third hour that cut visibility and made the horses' footing worse than anything they had navigated on the way out. She rode with the specific, focused blankness of a person who has completed the task they went out for and is now in the gap between that completion and the next thing, where the mind wants to process and the body needs to be managed, and the combination requires a particular kind of internal discipline. She was an hour from Blackspire when the first horn sounded. Single note, then silence, then two more. Not the siege pattern, the battle pattern. She looked at the soldier riding beside her. Northern Wall, he said. He had been at Blackspire long enough to know the signals without counting. Vorath called his force back, she said, more to herself than to him, working through the arithmetic. Vorath called his force back. This is not coming from the north, the soldier said. His voice had the flat quality of a person delivering information that they wish they did not have to deliver. The resonance in that horn is from the western approach. The western approach. Not Veldrath, not Kaelor, not Sothane, not any variable she had been tracking across the past 18 hours, something she had not seen. She drove her heels into the horse, and the horse went from a managed winter pace to something that was not safe in these conditions and was the only available option. And she rode toward Blackspire with the sleet cutting her face, and the horn signals continuing in a pattern she was parsing in real time and understanding with the specific dread of a person receiving clear information about something they should have anticipated and had not. Aldrich. Not a military operation, not a Veldrath assault, not Sothane's intelligence. Aldrich himself. She had been so focused on the mechanisms, the Veldrath force, the diplomatic channel, the internal command compromise, that she had run the operation as though Aldrich were remote, a coordinator, a man who pulled strings from a distance and waited for outcomes. But a man who had been building a 14-month operation did not stay remote when his mechanisms started failing. A man who had manufactured a famine and positioned a lord's daughter as a pressure point and cultivated Kaelor and Sothane simultaneously, was not a man who accepted failure from a distance. He was a man who had backup positions. He was a man who had been watching everything fall apart from wherever he was positioned and had decided that the only remaining option was direct action. She hit the outer courtyard at a pace that was not intended for the gate's dimensions and cleared it. The western wall was lit with torches in the pattern of active defensive engagement, not siege, which would be a heavier pattern, but infiltration response, which was lighter and more specific, and in some ways more dangerous because it indicated a breach of interior security rather than an exterior assault. Infiltration response meant someone was already inside the walls. She dismounted at a run. A garrison soldier caught her arm before she could move toward the western corridor. "Lady Vale, the king's orders. You are to be taken directly to the central command post." "Where is he?" she said. "Inner courtyard, western gate." A pause. "There was an assassination attempt 20 minutes ago." The word landed with the specific weight of the words that rearranged the entire landscape. "Is he?" she said. "Standing," the soldier said. "He is standing, but the command post is requesting your presence specifically." She went. The inner courtyard was controlled chaos, the specific organized disorder of a military command in active crisis management, soldiers moving with the directional urgency of people who have received orders and are executing them. The particular acoustic environment of crisis command where every voice is a shade louder than normal, and every movement has the contained speed of people who understand that the margin for error is thin. She saw Draven across the courtyard. He was standing. The soldier had been accurate about that. He was also bleeding from a cut along his right forearm that had soaked through the field dressing someone had applied and was still seeping, and his armor had the specific damage pattern of a man who had been in close quarters combat recently, the marks that blades leave when they come close enough to score metal without going through it. He saw her cross the courtyard. Something in his face, something that had been held at a specific internal tension for the past hour, released in the barely visible way of a person who has been managing a fear they could not acknowledge and has just received the information that releases it. She crossed to him. She looked at the arm. "This needs proper treatment." "Later," he said. "Now," she said. "Seris." She looked up at him. "Vorath is standing down," he said. "Yes," she said. "He wants a meeting, a direct one." She paused. "What happened here?" His jaw set. "Aldrich sent 4 men. Not military. They came in through the trade entrance on forged healer credentials." A pause that carried specific weight. "They knew the entry point." She absorbed that. "They knew because someone with access to the healer network's entry protocols gave him the information," Draven said. "Someone who has been inside these walls long enough to have access to those details." His eyes held hers. "I need you to tell me if anyone in your network here could have been compromised." She thought about it with the complete honesty the question required. Ran the names, ran the access levels, ran the specific knowledge each person had and what they could have transmitted and to whom. There was one answer she did not want to give. There was one answer that was accurate. "Marin," she said. The word was ash in her mouth. Draven closed his eyes for 1 second. 30 years at Blackspire. 3 significant political crises survived. The woman who had shown Seris the medical archives, who had spoken to her with the specific freedom of someone who had assessed her worth and decided it was real. The woman who had told her that trust was the most valuable resource in an empire, when it was trusted. 30 years was a very long time to be patient. 30 years was also a very long time to be building something that had nothing to do with the institution you appeared to serve. "She is not here," Draven said. "She left the Citadel this morning on a supply inventory request, authorized through standard channels." "She is not coming back," Seris said. "No," Draven said. The courtyard, the torches, the soldiers moving in their organized patterns. "Aldrich's 4 men," she said. "The attempt failed." "Because," Draven said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who has survived something that he will spend time later processing, but is not yet through the event and cannot spend time now. "2 of them reached the main corridor, and the 3rd one I managed in the training ground." He looked at his arm. He was good. The other 2 were better positioned. A pause. Fen was in the corridor. She looked at him. The young guard, he said. The one with the sister who has the coughing illness. He was not on scheduled rotation. He was there because he had started extending his watch in the western corridor after the siege, on his own initiative, because he said the western approach had been under-patrolled and he wanted to cover the gap. Draven paused. He took a blade that was not intended for him. Is he alive? She said. He is in the healer's hall, Draven said. He is alive because the blade hit the angle it hit. If he had been standing 3 inches to the left, he would not be. She turned immediately toward the healer's hall. Draven caught her hand. She stopped. He held her hand with the specific quality of a man who does not hold things carelessly, the full present attention of someone who is touching something he values, with the understanding that value is not permanent and has to be chosen repeatedly in the moments that allow it. Aldrich is gone, Draven said. He was in Silvermere when the operation ran. He will be moving now. When this fails, he moves. He held her gaze. I need to make a decision about Silvermere in the next hour, and I need to make it with full information. She looked at him. Tell me, she said. The decision requires us to treat Silvermere as an enemy province rather than a distressed ally, he said. It requires moving military authority into Silvermere's administrative structure and removing Aldrich's political apparatus at the source. He paused. It is not a gentle option. There are people in Silvermere who had no part in this and will experience the consequences of it regardless. She thought about the people in Silvermere's lower districts who had survived the famine that Aldrich had accelerated, who had endured the grain shortages that Aldrich had managed to serve his own construction of desperation, who had watched their neighbors starve while their senior minister was writing letters to a foreign commander about border realignments. Do it, she said. Draven looked at her. Aldrich used them as instruments, she said, the same way he used me. The difference between justice and revenge is whether the action you take is calibrated to prevent future harm or only to punish past harm. She held his gaze. Removing his apparatus prevents future harm. The people who had no part in it will survive the intervention. They have already survived worse. He looked at her for a long moment. You are not what he expected you to be, Draven said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. No, she said. He designed me as a pressure point. He did not account for the possibility that pressure points can also be load-bearing. Something moved in Draven's face. Not quite a smile. The specific quality of a man recognizing something that he will not forget. He released her hand. Go to Fen, he said. I will handle the order for Silvermere. She went. She was halfway across the courtyard when she heard him behind her, speaking to his garrison commander in the low, precise, operational register that carried across military spaces without effort. She heard the order go out. She heard the response, yes, sir. Immediate and without question, the response of a command structure that had been through enough in the past 24 hours to have stripped away any remaining ambiguity about where its loyalty sat. She was at the healer's hall entrance when the second signal sounded from the western tower. Not a horn. A bell. One bell struck 3 times with the specific interval she had memorized from Blackspire's signal codebook in her first week. She stopped at the entrance and counted. 1, 2, 3. Western gate. Movement detected. Armed party. Approaching under flag. Not Veldrath. Not infiltration. Not any signal pattern she had seen used in the 3 months she had been mapping Blackspire's operational language. This was a signal that the codebook had listed with a single annotation beside it, used once, 40 years ago. Incoming party under flag of surrender. She turned slowly from the healer's hall entrance. Across the courtyard, Draven had also stopped. He was looking at the western tower with the expression of a man receiving information that has no established category in his operational experience and is therefore requiring him to build a new one in real time. He looked at her across the courtyard. She looked back at him. The bell struck its 3rd note and went silent. In the silence, the gate mechanism of Blackspire's western entrance began to move. The heavy, deliberate iron and oak mechanics of a gate that had been built to resist everything and was now, by order of a king standing in his own courtyard, with a bloodied arm and an empire in various stages of controlled emergency, being opened. What came through it was not a military formation. It was a single rider, gray-cloaked, moving at a walk. the flag of parley in one hand, which was the flag that Blackspire's codebook listed as the instrument that had been used once, 40 years ago, and that theoretically guaranteed the bearer safe passage to present terms. The rider stopped in the center of the outer courtyard, removed the hood. The torchlight caught a face that Seris had last seen in Silvermere's administrative hall, delivering a sentence in 4 words. Lord Aldrich, in Blackspire's courtyard, under a flag of parley. Looking at her across the torchlit space with the expression of a man who has calculated that every external mechanism has failed and that the only remaining option is the one he had most thoroughly convinced himself he would never need. And in that expression, in the specific quality of a 14-month architect's face in the moment when he has decided to walk into the trap he built, she saw the shape of what he was about to offer. Something that was not in any of the letters. Something that Draven did not yet know existed. Something that was going to force both of them to make a choice that no amount of preparation or intelligence or 3 months of trust building had equipped them for. Because the worst thing Aldrich could do, standing in this courtyard under a flag of parley, was not threaten them. It was tell them the truth about something that the truth could still destroy. And Aldrich had always understood that the most precise weapon was accurate information, deployed at the moment when its target was least equipped to absorb it. He looked at Seris. He opened his mouth. Aldrich said, "Your mother did not die of fever." The courtyard held that sentence the way stone holds cold, completely without release. Seris stood at the healer's hall entrance and felt the words arrive in the specific way that certain pieces of information arrive, not as sound processed through understanding, but as structural impact, the kind that does not require interpretation because the body has already understood before the mind has finished receiving. She walked toward him. She was not aware of deciding to walk. She was aware of the courtyard flagstones under her feet, and the torch smoke moving sideways in the wind, and Aldrich watching her approach with the expression of a man who has deployed his final instrument and is now waiting with the particular stillness of someone who has nothing left to do but observe the consequence. She stopped 10 feet from his horse. "Get down," she said. He dismounted. He was older than she remembered, or the winter light was less forgiving than Silvermere's administrative hall had been, or the past 24 hours had compressed time in the way that crisis compresses time, making everything before it feel further away than the calendar would indicate. He was lean and gray-haired, and his face carried the specific quality of a man who had spent decades being underestimated, and had learned to make that underestimation into a weapon. He held the parley flag with both hands, not as a shield, as what it was, an instrument that bought him the next 10 minutes. "Your mother was investigating the grain diversion," he said. "She was a physician, like your father, but she was also the only member of Silvermere's household who understood the distribution records well enough to identify the pattern I had been building for 6 years. A pause. "She found it. She came to me privately. She gave me the opportunity to explain myself before she went to your father." Seris said, "What did you do?" "I made a decision," Aldrich said. "The same kind of decision I have made my entire career. The kind where the objective is large enough and the obstacle is specific enough that the arithmetic resolves in a direction that I would prefer it did not." The courtyard was completely silent. Every soldier present, every garrison member, every person in the torchlit space had gone still, with the specific stillness of people who understand they are witnessing something that exists outside the category of military operations and political maneuvering, something older and more fundamental. The kind of confrontation that does not require an audience but cannot be conducted without witnesses. Because some truths require the weight of being spoken in front of others to become real enough to act on. "She was my mother," Seris said. "Yes?" Aldrich said. "She was 34 years old," Seris said. "Yes," Aldrich said. "There is a particular kind of grief that does not announce itself with the symptoms that grief is supposed to produce. It does not arrive as weeping or as the collapse of composure or as the visible dissolution of a person's functional surface. It arrives as clarity, as the sudden brutal resolution of questions that have been unanswered for so long that the person carrying them has stopped noticing the weight. The way that a person stops noticing a familiar smell or a chronic ache until the moment it is removed, and the absence is louder than the presence ever was. Seris had spent 19 years believing her mother died of fever. She had spent 19 years carrying the specific shape of that loss. The physician's daughter who lost her mother to the thing physicians fought. The particular irony that her healer's training had incorporated as a kind of founding wound. She had told Draven about loneliness, about growing up feared for gifts she never asked to possess, and she had meant it. But underneath that loneliness was a specific hole that she had never had the accurate language for because the accurate language required information she did not have. She had it now. She looked at Aldrich. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has done what he came here to do and is now standing in the aftermath of it with the full weight of its meaning bearing down on him and nowhere left to redirect that weight. "Why are you here?" she said. Her voice was level. Not because she was managing it, because she was on the far side of something that performance could not reach. "Because everything I built is gone," he said. "Kalor, Sothane, Marin, the Veldrath arrangement. 14 months of construction, and it is gone in 48 hours. A pause. "I came because I am 61 years old, and I am tired, and I do not have another 14 months in me. And because I have been carrying what I did to your mother since the year you were 15, and I watched you at your father's table at midwinter, and understood that she would have been proud of you, which is the specific kind of knowledge that does not improve with age." Seris said nothing. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Aldrich said. "I know the architecture of what I did. I know the arithmetic does not resolve in my favor regardless of what I intended, or what Silvermere's political situation required, or what I told myself across 19 years about necessity." He paused. "I am surrendering, formally, to you, not to the king, to you. Because the flag of parley is the last instrument I have, and the only person I owe it to is standing in front of me." Draven had crossed the courtyard. He stood beside Seris now, close enough that she was aware of his presence in the peripheral way she was always aware of him, as a gravitational fact simply there, organizing the space around it. He looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked at Draven with the expression of a man making a final assessment of the variable he had most thoroughly misread. "You did not keep her inside," Aldrich said, not accusatory, almost wondering. "I calculated. Everything I built assumed you would keep her inside Blackspire, that your instinct for possession and control would override the operational logic of sending her out." A pause. "I was wrong about what you are." "Most people are," Draven said. His voice was flat and quiet and carried no satisfaction, which was its own form of statement. "What did you think he was?" Seris said to Aldrich. Aldrich looked at her. "I thought he was the same thing every powerful man becomes eventually. A man whose strength has curdled into the need to own what he values, rather than trust it." He paused. "I was wrong, which means the entire architecture of the operation was built on a false foundation." He looked at Draven. "You trusted her, in the specific operational sense, not as performance, not as a calculated display of progressive leadership." Another pause. "You actually trusted her." "Yes," Draven said. "That is why it failed," Aldrich said. And in his voice was something that Seris had not expected to hear there. Not quite admiration, but the specific acknowledgement of a man who has spent his career exploiting the predictable behaviors of power and has just encountered for the first time power behaving in a way that was outside his model. The torches burned in their brackets. Somewhere in the Citadel's interior, a door opened and closed. The ordinary sound of a building that was still functioning around its crisis, still breathing and moving in the ways of a place inhabited by hundreds of people who had not stopped needing food and warmth, and the ordinary continuity of daily existence, just because the people at the top of the structure were standing in the courtyard resolving something fundamental. Life continues in the margins of even the most significant moments. That is one of its most consoling and most brutal qualities. "Aldrich of Silvermere," Draven said, "you are formally in the custody of the Ashen Crown Empire. You will be held in Blackspire's administrative detention pending a council review of the charges against you, which include conspiracy against the crown, arrangement of foreign military action against imperial territory, and—" He paused. He looked at Seris. The pause carried the specific weight of a man giving someone else the right to complete a sentence that belongs to them. She looked at Aldrich. "And the death of Mira Vale," she said, "physician of Silvermere, 19 years ago." Aldrich closed his eyes. When he opened them, he handed the parley flag to the soldier who had moved to his side, and he walked with that soldier toward the interior of the citadel, with the particular quality of a man who has set down something he has been carrying for a very long time and is not entirely certain what it feels like to move without the weight. Seris watched him go. Draven stood beside her. He did not say anything immediately, which was the correct response. Some information requires a silence after it that is proportional to its weight, and the weight of what had just been said in the courtyard was the kind that required significant silence. She let the silence be what it was. Then she said, "I need to see Fen." "Yes," Draven said. She went. Fen was conscious. That was the first thing. The specific, overwhelming relief of a piece of information that arrives in the body before the mind finishes processing it. The way that the confirmation of something feared lost produces a physical response that analysis cannot fully account for. He was conscious, and he was in pain, and he had the particular gray quality of a person who has lost enough blood that the body is redirecting its resources with the single-minded pragmatism of systems under stress. He looked up when she came in. "Lady Vale," he said. "Don't," she said. She pulled the chair beside him and sat and looked at the wound dressing with the clinical attention that she could access even in this state, maybe especially in this state, because the clinical attention was the part of her that knew how to be useful, regardless of what else was happening. The dressing was adequate. The angle of the blade's entry was survivable. Survivable was the word she had been holding at arm's length since Draven told her, and she allowed herself to hold it directly now to feel the full weight of its accuracy. "You were not on schedule," she said. "No," he said. His voice was thin but present. "You extended your watch." "The western corridor," he said. "After the siege, it seemed there was a gap. Nobody assigned it. I thought—" He stopped, breathed. "My sister's cough is better." She looked at him. "The herb," he said. "It worked. She wrote me. 2 weeks ago. I forgot to tell you. The healer's hall. The torches. The ordinary, specific, irreducible fact of a 23-year-old soldier who had extended his watch because he noticed a gap, and who had written down that his sister's cough was better, and had forgotten to pass along the information in the chaos of the past 2 weeks. This was what the operations and the letters and the 14-month conspiracies were ultimately operating on, not abstractions of power or territory or political architecture, but the specific lives of specific people who extended their watches and worried about their sisters, and stood in corridors at the wrong time and the right time simultaneously. "I know," she said. "I heard." She checked the dressing. She adjusted the positioning of his arm. She told him what to expect in the next 48 hours with the complete, honest precision that she gave to every patient, the accurate picture, not the comfortable one, because people who knew what was coming could prepare for it, and people who were protected from accurate information could not. He listened. When she was done, he said, "Is it over?" She thought about the question. "The immediate crisis," she said. "Yes." She paused. "The rest of it takes longer." He nodded as though that was the answer he expected. She left him sleeping. She found Draven in the eastern garden. He was at the low wall where they had stood 3 days ago, or what felt like 3 days ago, and was probably less, time having done its crisis compression again. He was looking at the eastern mountains with the specific quality of a man who has completed the operational demands of the past 18 hours and has arrived, for the first time, in the space where the things that were set aside to manage the crisis are waiting. She stood beside him. The garden was the same dead winter garden. The frost-killed root structures, the iron lanterns, the wall that looked out toward the territory that had sent its enemies toward them and received them back. The mountains were the same mountains, but the quality of standing here was different from 3 days ago, in the way that all repeated experiences are different from their first iteration. Not better or worse exactly, but layered, carrying the accumulated weight of what had happened between the first time and now. "Vorath confirmed," Draven said. "His force has withdrawn from the pass. The meeting is scheduled for 6 days from now. Neutral ground. The border settlement." "Kala's settlement," she said. "Kala's settlement," he said. "She will attend as a witness. Her idea." Seris almost smiled. "Yes, it would be." A pause. "The Silvermere administrative action is underway," Draven said. "The garrison is moved. Aldrich's apparatus in the provincial capital is being dismantled. It will take time. The people Aldrich used to build it will resist where they can and cooperate where resistance is not worth the cost. A pause. The grain distribution I have been running quietly into the northern provinces. I am going to formalize it, officially. I am done pretending that governing well is something to hide because it makes rivals comfortable. She looked at him. That is a significant change, she said. Yes, he said. The court will interpret it as softening. The court, he said, watched me break a war commander's wrist in the first hour of your arrival here, dismantle a succession conspiracy in 48 hours, counter a 14-month intelligence operation that penetrated my command structure, and conduct a diplomatic resolution with a hostile border state through a channel that every formal instrument had burned. They can interpret the grain policy however they want. Their interpretation does not change the outcome. She looked at the mountains. My mother's name was Mira, she said. I know, he said. Marin's archives. I found the file 3 weeks ago. I did not know what I was looking at. A pause. I understand now. She held that. The specific quality of grief that she was carrying was not the acute kind. That would come later, in the private spaces where there was room for it, when the operational pressure had reduced enough that the things set aside to manage the crisis could be faced directly. What she was carrying now was the preliminary form of it, the grief that knows what it is before it has become what it will become. The specific weight of understanding that a question you stopped asking because you believed it answered has been reopened with an answer you did not expect. Her mother had been 34. She had found something worth risking her safety over. She had gone to Aldrich privately, which was an act of the specific kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. Not dramatic, not public, not performed. The private courage of a person who believes in giving someone the opportunity to make the right choice before she forces the choice to be made. Aldrich had not made the right choice, but her mother had made hers. There was something in that worth holding. Seris would find it in time. She knew herself well enough to know that she would find it because finding things in the rubble of what she had been through was the skill she had been building across her entire life. The healer's equivalent of the soldier's ability to assess damage and determine what was worth salvaging. Everything was worth salvaging. That was the article of faith she had arrived at somewhere in the years of doing the work. The conviction was not optimism. Optimism was a posture, a way of presenting toward the future. The conviction was operational. It was the determination to find what could be used even in circumstances that appeared to offer nothing usable. She had been brought to Blackspire as the price of grain. She had found, in the citadel carved from volcanic stone in the empire of harsh winters and harsher politics, a healer network that trusted her, and a young soldier who extended his watch because he noticed a gap, and an archivist who had spent 30 years accumulating knowledge and had made choices with it that Seris would spend time grieving before she was done, and a king who had been building walls since he was 19 years old and had decided, across 3 months of paying the kind of attention that walls are designed to prevent, that the walls were costing him more than they were protecting him from. None of that was what she had been sent for. All of it was real. Draven, she said. He looked at her. I need to tell you something that I have been deciding whether to tell you for 3 weeks, she said. He waited. The visions, she said. They have been changing in the past month. The content, not more political information, not more tactical intelligence, different. She paused. I have been seeing Blackspire in spring, the gardens with actual growth in them, the lower city markets, specific details, not threat patterns, not warning configurations, just the place as it exists when it is not under threat. A pause. And you in it, consistently. He looked at her for a moment. What am I doing? He said. Walking, she said, in the inner courtyard, without armor. She held his gaze. It is the most peaceful image I have ever received, and I do not have a strategic interpretation for it. So I did not tell you because I was not certain what category it belonged in. He was quiet for a moment. I know what category it belongs in, he said. Yes, she said. I think I do too. The wind came through the garden, cold and specific, carrying the particular quality of mountain air that is not comfortable and is completely honest. The air of a place that does not pretend to be warmer than it is, and gives you, in exchange for that honesty, the specific clarity of a landscape that has nothing to hide. He turned from the wall and faced her fully in the way that he had been doing with increasing frequency. The complete facing, the turning of his whole attention toward her without the partial orientation of a man who is managing multiple priorities simultaneously. The choice to be entirely present, which is not a simple choice for a person whose entire professional existence has been built around the management of competing demands. She had learned across 3 months that this was how he said things he did not yet have words for. With his body, with his attention, with the specific quality of his presence that was different from his professional presence in the way that mattered most. She had learned to say things the same way. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the scarred side, the old wound that had been part of his face long enough that his face had incorporated it. She felt the specific temperature of his skin in the cold air and the specific quality of his stillness under her hand. The stillness of a man who has learned that stillness in this context is not the stillness of control, but the stillness of choosing to receive something without managing it. "I love you," she said. The 3 words in the cold garden air. Not the first time she had said them. She had said them once, in a burning corridor in the worst night the Citadel had seen in years, meaning them fully in the specific way of people who say true things when the cost of saying them is suddenly lower than the cost of leaving them unsaid. This time was different. This time was not crisis. This time was not the stripped-back honesty of extremity. This time was chosen, deliberately, in the space of ordinary winter cold and garden torchlight and the quiet aftermath of a storm that had passed. The choice made in the calm was the real one. That was what she had learned across the weeks of watching Draven govern and fight and manage, and occasionally, in the moments he forgot she was watching, simply be. That the person you were in the crisis was not the truest version. It was the revealed version, the version that appeared when the surface was stripped. But the truest version was the one you chose when you had the luxury of choosing, when the sword was not at your throat and the walls were not burning and no one was forcing your hand. She was choosing, now, in the quiet. He put his hand over hers. His other hand came to her shoulder, deliberate and present, the full weight of his attention given physical form. "I love you," he said. His voice in the cold garden had the quality it had in the library months ago, when he told her that his father had carried the same gift and that a ruler feared blindness, not knowledge. The quality of a man who has found the accurate word after long search and is using it with the precision it deserves. No performance, no management, just the word, true in his mouth, given to the air between them and to the woman standing in the dead garden in the empire of his making. They stood there for a long time, not kissing, not speaking, just standing in the specific proximity of 2 people who have decided that what exists between them is real and worth the cost of protecting it in a world that will always generate new instruments designed to use it against them. That was the thing that Aldrich had not been able to model, the thing that had defeated 14 months of careful construction. Not Draven's strength, which was real, and not Seris's intelligence, which was real, and not the specific quality of her visions or his military command or any of the individual instruments they had brought to bear on the crisis. The thing that Aldrich had not been able to model was 2 people who had decided to trust each other in the full knowledge of what trust costs, and who had maintained that decision under conditions specifically designed to make it impossible. Trust is not a feeling, it is a practice. It is the repeated choice, made in the specific conditions where choosing otherwise would be easier and more defensible, to act as though the other person's fundamental reliability is real. Made once, it is hope. Made repeatedly, under pressure, it becomes something that has the structural integrity of stone. They had been building it since a ceremony at an obsidian altar, where a man had placed a black iron ring on a woman's finger without a single word of devotion. They had built it out of sword lessons and midnight conversations and visions shared in a winter library, and a cloak placed over sleeping shoulders, and southern fruit reserved for nobility, and a name called in a burning corridor, and hands checking for wounds and trust given operationally before it was given personally, which was, she had come to understand, the order in which Draven Thorne was capable of giving things. Capability first, then everything else. She had worked with what she had. Spring came to Blackspire the way spring comes to northern fortresses built from volcanic stone. Not gently, not with the soft incremental warming of lower latitudes, but in specific, decisive moments when the temperature crossed a threshold and the things that had been waiting underground for months began their sudden, determined emergence. The gardens erupted in 2 weeks. The lower city markets expanded into the streets in the way they did when the cold stopped punishing outdoor commerce. The passes cleared enough for the first post-winter trade convoys, carrying with them the particular energy of systems that have been compressed and are now releasing. Seris was in the inner courtyard on the first genuinely warm morning when she saw it. Draven, walking toward the eastern gate, without armor. His shirt was the dark wool of his off-duty hours. His hands were at his sides. He was moving with the unhurried quality of a man who has, for this particular hour of this particular morning, set down the operational weight of running an empire and is simply occupying the space of his own existence without the armor that space usually requires. He had the old scar and the new one on his forearm from Aldrich's men, and the particular weathered quality of a face that had been outside in difficult conditions for 40 years. And he was walking through the courtyard of the citadel he had ruled for 11 years and had almost lost twice in 1 week. And he looked, in this specific moment, like a man who has arrived somewhere that he had been traveling toward for a long time without knowing the destination. He saw her watching. He crossed toward her. "The Vorath Treaty ratification," he said. "The courier confirmed this morning, both seals." "I know," she said. "Calla sent word." He nodded. "The Silvermere Council has been reorganized," he said. "The new minister takes his position next month. I reviewed his file." A pause. "He was one of your father's students." She looked at him. "I know," he said. "I thought you should." She absorbed that. The specific quality of a man who had gone looking for something he knew would matter to her and had brought it back without announcement. Not as performance, not as demonstration, but as the ordinary expression of a person who has organized part of their attention permanently around what matters to someone else. This was love in its functional form. Not the declaration, which was easy. Not the grand gesture, which was easier. The quiet, consistent daily reorientation of a person's attention toward another person's concerns, maintained without fanfare through the ordinary weeks that are most of a life. "Walk with me," she said. He fell into step beside her, and they walked through the courtyard in the spring morning, the citadel alive around them with the specific sounds and rhythms of Blackspire at peace, which was not silence, which was never silence, but was the particular kind of noise that indicated things were functioning at their intended level, the operational hum of a system working rather than the sharp, discordant noise of a system under stress. She was aware of the soldiers they passed, who maintained their professional bearing but whose eyes carried the specific quality of people who have watched something significant happen and are still in the process of integrating it into their understanding of the world they live in. The garrison had watched their king stand in the council chamber and name a foreign bride as queen, had watched the citadel come under assault and survive it, had watched a succession conspiracy dismantled and a command structure compromised and repaired, and a diplomatic crisis resolved through a channel that none of them had known existed, had watched their king walk through his own courtyard without armor on a warm morning. What they were integrating was not any single one of those things. It was the pattern of a man who had built himself around the premise that strength required the elimination of everything that could be used against him, and had discovered, at the cost of 48 of the most difficult hours his empire had yet produced, that the premise was incomplete. Not wrong. Incomplete. Strength without connection was real. It produced real results. It held borders and won campaigns and generated the kind of order that empires require to function. But it could not do the thing that had ultimately saved Blackspire from Aldrich's operation. The thing that had required someone to ride 4 hours through sleet to a border settlement and ask a healer for a door that no diplomatic instrument could have opened. The thing that required one person to know another person well enough to call their name in the dark, in the exact compressed form that could be received in the single second available. That was what connection could do. That was what it was for. Draven had built his empire on strength. He was building something else now. On top of it, alongside it, woven through it in the way that the stronger material does not replace the load-bearing one, but distributes the load differently, more sustainably, across more points of contact with the world. It was not a lesser project. It was a harder one. They walked to the low wall at the eastern end of the inner courtyard. Not the garden, the working wall, the functional part of the citadel's perimeter where the stone was worn smooth by decades of soldiers' hands, and the view was not picturesque but was honest, looking out over the eastern approach with its bare, practical geography, and the mountains behind it carrying their permanent quality of indifference to human arrangements. She leaned against the wall. He stood beside her. In the weeks since the crisis, they had found this particular quality of being together. Not always speaking, not always performing the togetherness, but simply present in the shared space of two people who have decided that the space between them is worth occupying. The specific ease of people who have been through something significant and have emerged from it with a clearer understanding of what they were to each other than the understanding they went in with. Kaler's exile was confirmed, she said. Yes, Draven said. He reached the southern border 4 days ago. The escort reported no incident. And Marin, she said. A pause. Still not found, Draven said. She had 3 days before we identified her. She knows this citadel better than the citadel knows itself. He paused. I have stopped expecting to find her. Seris held that. Marin had been 30 years at Blackspire. 30 years of watching and recording and knowing things that no one else knew, and making choices about that knowledge that had, in the end, led her out of the building she had inhabited longer than most of its current garrison had been alive. Seris did not know what had made her Aldrich's instrument, did not know whether it was conviction or coercion, or the slow accumulation of resentment that sometimes develops in people who are genuinely capable but structurally invisible. Did not know and would not know. Now, some things remained unresolved. That was the actual texture of aftermath, not the clean resolution of all variables, but the specific untidiness of a world that continues generating its complexity after the acute phase of the crisis has passed. The historian's version of events would eventually produce a clean narrative, causes and effects arranged in legible sequence, lessons extracted and labeled. The lived version did not have that clarity. The lived version had Marin's empty office and Fenn's healing arm and Aldrich in the administrative detention block and a Veldrath treaty with 2 seals and a healer named Kala who had become, without any formal appointment, the most important diplomatic asset in the Empire's Eastern relationship. The lived version was what it was. Draven, she said. Yes, he said. When the court asked you why you named me queen, she said. In the council session after the siege, so Thane asked. In the formal record. She had read the transcript. You said I was the future the Empire had nearly destroyed inside itself. Yes, he said. What did you mean? She said. He looked at the mountains for a moment. I meant, he said, that the empire I inherited was built on the premise that power required the elimination of everything that could be used against it. Every vulnerability managed, every connection measured, every person at arm's length. He paused. That premise built something that was strong and brittle, strong enough to hold borders, brittle enough that a well-placed operation could compromise it from within because there was nothing inside it except the power structure itself. No depth, no genuine loyalty, only managed loyalty. No genuine knowledge, only managed intelligence. Another pause. You built depth in 3 months through the healers and the archivists and Fenn and the healer at the border settlement and the Veldrath commander's wife. You built the thing I had been systematically preventing, and the thing you built was what saved us. She looked at him. The future the Empire nearly destroyed inside itself, she said. Yes, he said. Not you specifically. The capacity you represent. The willingness to be genuinely connected to the people you are responsible for, rather than simply managing them from the correct administrative distance. He paused. I nearly prevented it from existing here, not through malice, through the philosophy I was given and never sufficiently examined. She thought about what it meant to say that out loud. To a man who had ruled alone for 11 years. To a court that respected strength above every other quality. The specific courage required to identify your own foundational premise as incomplete and say so in the language of public record. It was not the courage of battle, which she respected and understood. It was a different kind. The courage that does not produce spectacle. The courage that produces change. You know, she said, that they will test it. Yes, he said. Every rival house, every border territory, every ambitious general who watches you formalize the grain distribution and name a foreign bride as queen and meet the Veldrath High Commander on neutral ground, they will all be running the calculation of what this means for your vulnerability profile. Yes, he said. And you are not changing course, she said. No, he said, because Aldrich ran that calculation for 14 months with more information than any of them will have and better instruments than most of them can construct. And he was defeated not by any single military or political countermove, but by the specific thing he could not model. He paused. I am done building the version of this empire that produces what Aldrich tried to exploit. I am building the version that produces what defeated him. The mountains held their quality of permanent cold and permanent indifference. Below the wall, the eastern approach was quiet. The roads were beginning to show the first signs of spring use. Wheel tracks in softening mud, the evidence of the trade convoys starting to move again. The ordinary commerce of an empire going about its business in the space that security provides. She had arrived on those roads in a wagon with 6 thin-ribbed horses wrapped in silver mourning silk as the price of grain. She was standing at this wall as herself, as the person she had been the entire time underneath every role that circumstances had assigned her: the tribute bride, the famine queen, the foreign spy who wasn't, the diplomatic channel, the healer, the visionary, the woman who called a king's name in a burning corridor and put her hand over his on a garden wall and told the truth in the full knowledge of what truth costs. She had always been that person. She had simply arrived in a place where that person was, for the first time, permitted to be fully visible. She put her hand in Draven's. He closed his fingers around hers with the specific, careful deliberateness of a man who has learned, at significant cost and through significant revision of his foundational premises, that the things you hold with care are the things that last. The spring morning continued. Blackspire breathed around them, stone and iron and the ordinary momentum of a place that had survived everything it had faced and was now, in the specific quiet of an aftermath that had not yet been fully processed, figuring out what it wanted to become next. What it would become was not yet decided. That was the point. The deciding was the work. And for the first time in 11 years of an empire built on the premise that one man's strength was sufficient to hold everything together, that work would be done by 2 people who had chosen each other clearly, in the cold and the quiet and the full knowledge of the cost, which is the only way that anything worth building ever gets built at all.